Chapter 1. The Unseen Presence. The house stood alone on the edge of the woods, surrounded by tall, skeletal trees that whispered with every gust of wind. It was an old, forgotten structure, its walls weathered by time. The once white paint now a faded gray, peeling away like dry skin. Moss clung to the bricks, and ivy twisted its way up the sides, as if nature itself was slowly reclaiming it. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of dampness and decay. Dust hung in the air, swirling lazily in the dim light that filtered through grime-covered windows. The wooden floors creaked under the weight of nothing but time, their age betrayed by deep cracks and dark stains that hinted at a history best left forgotten. The rooms were a maze of shadows, each one darker than the last. There was a silence so profound that even the faintest sound, a distant rustle, a barely audible creak, became magnified, echoing through the stillness. The air felt heavy, oppressive, pressing down on everything like an invisible force. The stairs led upwards in a narrow, winding spiral, their worn steps sagging in the middle. They groaned with each tentative step, as if they hadn't borne the weight of a living soul in years. The second floor was even darker, the light from outside barely reaching the long, narrow hallway that stretched out before it. The shadows danced along the walls, flickering as the wind outside picked up, causing the windows to rattle in their frames. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar. The gap was just wide enough to reveal nothing but darkness beyond. The door was old, its paint chipped and faded, a large crack running down the middle. Despite its age, it seemed untouched by time in a way that felt wrong, as if it had been waiting, undisturbed, for something or someone to return. The temperature dropped noticeably as one approached the door. A chill that wasn't just from the cold air, it was a different kind of cold, one that seemed to seep into the bones, carrying with it a sense of dread that was impossible to shake. The house itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation, the silence deepening into a void that threatened to consume everything. A shiver ran through the house, a tremor that rippled through the walls and floors, like the faintest echo of something ancient stirring beneath. The sensation was subtle, but undeniable, a shift in the atmosphere, as if something had awakened. From somewhere deep within the house, there came a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a dragging, scraping noise, as though something heavy was being pulled slowly across the floor. It came and went, fading in and out, teasing at the edge of perception. The sound carried with it a sense of malevolence, an unspoken warning to leave, to turn back before it was too late. But there was nowhere to turn. The house was a labyrinth of shadows, and every step deeper into it felt like a descent into something darker. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thicker, suffocating. The sound grew louder, more distinct, a rhythmic scrape, followed by a hollow thud, like a slow, deliberate heartbeat reverberating through the wooden floors. The unseen presence made itself known not with sight, but with the suffocating weight of its existence. It clung to the walls, lurking just out of reach, always watching. The air crackled with the sensation of being observed, every hair standing on end, as though something was hovering just inches away, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The darkness within the room at the end of the hall seemed alive, pulsing with malevolent intent. It was as if the shadows themselves had taken on a life of their own, writhing and twisting, always on the edge of perception. The temperature dropped again, this time bringing with it the faintest hint of a foul odor. Something rotten, something dead. There was a sudden bang, a door slamming shut somewhere deep in the house. The silence returned, thicker than before, more oppressive. The house was awake now, its presence undeniable, filling every corner with dread. And in the darkness, in the silence, something waited, unseen, but felt. Chapter 2. echoes of the past. Morning light filtered through the dusty windows, casting pale streaks across the barren rooms. The daylight offered little comfort. The house remained shrouded in an eerie stillness, as if it existed apart from the world outside. The air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of mildew and abandonment, but beneath it lingered a faint trace of something older, something sour and metallic that clung to the senses like a lingering sickness. The walls seemed to close in as time passed, growing darker, the shadows deeper. Each room held remnants of a forgotten life. A cracked porcelain doll with glassy eyes, a tarnished mirror hanging crookedly, reflecting the murkiness of its surroundings. Dust had settled thickly on everything, an undisturbed layer that hinted at years of neglect. Yet here and there, the dust was disturbed, faint trails marking where something, or someone, had passed recently. A framed photograph on a side table caught the light. Its image faded almost beyond recognition. What remained was a blurred outline of a family, 2 adults and a child, smiling in a moment frozen in time. But the smiles seemed distorted, as if time had warped the image, turning it into a grotesque mockery of happiness. The glass covering the frame was cracked, and beneath it, faint scratches marred the photograph, as though something had tried to claw its way out. The old grandfather clock in the corner stood silent, its pendulum still, but its presence was unnerving. Though it no longer marked the passage of time, it felt as though it was watching, its vacant face staring blankly into the room. The hands were frozen at a few minutes past midnight, and the silence around it was so profound that it seemed to absorb all sound. The floorboards groaned with unseen pressure, the creaks echoing through the house like distant footsteps. As the minutes dragged on, the noises grew more distinct, more deliberate. It was as if the house was trying to communicate, to relay some forgotten message trapped within its decaying walls. A draft swept through the house, rattling doors and causing the peeling wallpaper to flutter, as though invisible hands were running down the length of the corridor. The temperature dropped sharply, and with it came a sense of oppressive dread. The house wasn't merely empty. It was occupied by a presence that had been there long before any intruder set foot inside. It was as though the very structure of the place had absorbed years of torment and malice, and now exhaled that darkness in waves. A portrait hanging above the mantelpiece drew attention. A stern-faced man, eyes cold and lifeless, painted in deep, shadowed hues. His expression was one of contempt, and his gaze seemed to follow anyone who dared to step into the room. The frame was ornate, but tarnished, and the canvas was cracked and peeling. Despite its age, the man's eyes remained vivid, almost too real, and the longer one stared, the more it felt as though the painting itself was breathing, the dark pupils dilating and shrinking in rhythm with the pulse of the house. Down the narrow hallway, past doorways leading into darkened rooms, the floor sloped subtly, guiding whoever ventured there toward a specific door. A door that seemed older than the rest of the house, with a warped, weathered surface that exuded an aura of unease. The door was closed, but a faint breeze seeped from underneath it, carrying with it a chill that sank into the bones. The door had no lock, but it resisted opening as though something on the other side was holding it shut. The handle was ice cold, and the wood groaned when touched, as if protesting. But after a moment of tension, it slowly creaked open with a sound that echoed through the house like a mournful wail. Inside was a small, windowless room, bare except for a single chair placed in the center, facing the doorway. The chair was ancient, its wood darkened with age and wear, and upon it rested an old book, bound in cracked leather, the edges worn from countless fingers turning its pages. The book seemed out of place in its pristine condition, untouched by dust or decay, as though it had been waiting. The cover bore no title, just an embossed sigil that was almost too faint to see. There was an unnatural draw to the book, a compulsion to open it despite the gnawing sense of dread that accompanied the thought. The air in the room grew heavier, pressing down with an almost tangible weight, as if some unseen force was leaning in, watching intently. The walls seemed closer now, the ceiling lower, the shadows creeping inward like tendrils. Outside the room, the house groaned, wood and nails straining, the sounds echoing down the hallways in rhythmic pulses. It was a heartbeat, a slow, deliberate beat that matched the scrape and drag of something unseen moving in the floors above. The pages of the book fluttered, despite the stillness of the air. They moved of their own accord, turning slowly as though being read by invisible eyes. Each turn brought forth the scent of age, musty, ancient, tinged with something darker. The sigil on the cover pulsed faintly with an unnatural light, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls. It was as though the book itself was alive, breathing in the tension, feeding off the fear that filled the room. The unseen presence returned, stronger now, suffocating. It lurked in the edges of vision, a shape without form, a whisper without sound. It coiled around the room like smoke, curling into every crevice, pressing against the skin with a cold touch that left an icy trail. The house was no longer just a place. It was a living entity, pulsating with a malevolence that was ancient and unrelenting. The echoes of the past filled the air, memories not of joy, but of suffering, of despair. The house had seen things, had witnessed events that had scarred it, twisting it into a vessel of darkness. And now, it waited patiently, ready to reveal its secrets to anyone who dared to stay long enough. Chapter 3: Creaks in the Silence. Nightfall brought a suffocating stillness to the house. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light casting an otherworldly glow on the frost-covered windows. Inside, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint slivers of silver that slipped through the gaps in the curtains. The air was dense, thick with the weight of something unseen, as if the very shadows themselves were alive, watching with unseen eyes. The old wooden floorboards groaned under the strain of years, every creak amplified by the silence. It was a language of the house, a series of sharp, brittle noises that cut through the quiet like the crackle of bones snapping. The creaks were not random. They formed a rhythm, a deliberate pattern that echoed through the empty corridors, as if something was moving slowly, methodically, pacing with purpose. The house was a labyrinth of long hallways and forgotten rooms, each one colder and more oppressive than the last. The walls seemed to shift in the dark, subtly warping with each passing hour, as if the house was reshaping itself, closing in, drawing all who wandered within deeper into its grasp. The faint scent of rot lingered in the air, a mixture of mold, decayed wood, and something fouler, like the breath of something long dead. In the attic above, the silence was even more profound, almost tangible, pressing down like a heavy blanket. Dust clung to the rafters, forming thick cobwebs that sagged under their own weight. The space was cluttered with forgotten belongings, old trunks, moth-eaten clothes, and broken furniture, all draped in layers of dust, frozen in time. But amid the stillness, the air crackled with a presence, something unseen, something waiting. The creaks began again, slow and deliberate, as if testing the silence. It was a sound that shouldn't have come from the floor below, where no one was walking, where nothing living stirred. The sound grew louder, closer, echoing up through the walls like the tapping of skeletal fingers. Each creak was accompanied by a faint shuffling, the noise of something dragging across the floor, a weighty, deliberate motion, like feet shuffling through dust. A shadow moved in the far corner of the attic, shifting against the darkness. It was barely perceptible, more of a ripple in the air than a solid form, but its presence was undeniable. The air grew colder, biting against the skin with an unnatural chill. The creaks continued, now interspersed with faint taps, an almost rhythmic pattern, as if following some forgotten beat, like the ghost of a tune played in a place where time had ceased to matter. The wooden beams above groaned under the pressure of something unseen, the sound vibrating through the walls, traveling down the house like the reverberations of a bell. It was as if the very structure of the house was alive, its bones creaking and shifting with some internal strain. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in rhythm with the noises that filled the night air. Downstairs in the parlor, the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. The old rocking chair, untouched for decades, began to sway gently, the wood creaking in time with the shifting floorboards above. It rocked back and forth with a slow, deliberate motion, groaning under the invisible weight of something unseen. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but as the minutes ticked by, the chair's pace quickened, as if driven by some unseen hand. The clock on the mantelpiece, long frozen at midnight, began to tick faintly, its rusted hands jerking forward in sudden, unnatural bursts. The sound was sharp, each tick a staccato crack in the silence, echoing off the walls in a room that should have remained undisturbed. The clock's pendulum, which hadn't moved in years, swayed weakly, its rhythm unsteady, as if struggling against the grip of time itself. In the hallway, the shadows lengthened unnaturally, stretching out like claws reaching for something just out of sight. The creaks in the floorboards became more erratic, now joined by faint, hollow knocks, like someone tapping gently from within the walls. The sound grew louder, more insistent, moving closer with each passing moment. The air buzzed with tension, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the house like a distant whisper. Faint, incoherent, but filled with an underlying sense of dread. The temperature plummeted, the chill sinking deep into the walls, frosting the edges of the window panes. From the darkness, the creaks took on a different tone, a groaning, almost mournful wail, as if the house itself was lamenting something lost, something buried deep within its rotting foundation. The walls groaned in response, a deep, resonant sound like the grinding of stone, the weight of years pressing down. The attic was now completely dark, the faint light of the moon swallowed by the encroaching shadows. The creaks from below reached a crescendo, blending with the slow scrape of something heavy dragging across the floor, heading steadily toward the stairs. The air was thick with anticipation, every fiber of the house vibrating with the tension of something about to break. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the creaks stopped. Silence flooded the house, filling the void with a suffocating emptiness. The rocking chair in the parlor stilled, the clock on the mantel stopped ticking, and the air grew still, as if the house had exhaled its final breath. The darkness pressed in, heavier than ever, as if it carried the weight of centuries of forgotten sorrows. In the dead of night, the house stood silent, but it was an expectant silence, a pause before the next breath. Somewhere deep within its ancient walls, something stirred, shifting its weight, waiting for the darkness to take hold once more. Chapter 4. The Cold Spot. The morning brought no warmth. The sun's feeble rays were swallowed by a sky thick with gray clouds, casting the house in a perpetual gloom. The air was damp and chilled, clinging to the skin like a wet shroud. Inside, the darkness was not just a matter of shadows, but seemed to pulse with an energy that grew stronger with each passing day. The house had taken on a life of its own, and it was beginning to assert its presence. The cold spot first appeared in the center of the old dining room, a subtle, icy patch that made the air ripple faintly. The temperature there was noticeably lower than the rest of the house, a concentrated chill that defied explanation. The room was sparse, furnished only with a long, dark wooden table and a set of mismatched chairs. The table was scratched and gouged as if something had clawed at it in desperation. The chairs, some missing legs or splintered in places, were arranged haphazardly, but they all faced the same spot in the room, the cold spot. Frost began to form on the edges of the large mirror hanging on the wall. It spread in delicate patterns, like spiderwebs etched in ice, creeping across the surface until the entire mirror was glazed over. The reflection in the frosted glass was murky, as though the room it mirrored existed in another time, another reality. The image was distorted, shadows bleeding into one another, twisting the familiar into something alien. The cold spot slowly expanded, its reach extending outward in uneven pulses, like an invisible heart beating beneath the floorboards. The chill deepened, so intense that breath misted in the air. The walls began to groan softly, the wood contracting as the temperature plummeted. From somewhere deeper within the house came faint cracking noises, as if the very bones of the structure were straining under the weight of the cold. The sensation of being watched was more intense in this room than anywhere else in the house. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, an almost palpable presence hovering just out of sight. It was as though something stood in the center of the room, unseen but not unfelt, its gaze cold and unyielding, rooted in a hatred older than memory. Cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling, trembling in a draft that couldn't be felt elsewhere. The curtains rustled gently, though the windows were tightly shut. The sound was faint, but it carried a rhythm, a pattern that repeated itself in short bursts, almost like the faint rustle of cloth dragging across the floor. Dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through the stained curtains, swirling around the cold spot before scattering away, as if repelled by whatever lingered there. The walls around the room grew darker, the paint peeling away to reveal ancient plaster underneath, cracked and stained. Faint shapes began to emerge in the patterns of decay, faces, twisted in silent anguish, etched into the very fabric of the house. They were vague at first, mere suggestions of form, but with each passing minute, they grew clearer, more defined, their expressions frozen in terror. The ceiling above the cold spot was discolored, dark streaks running down from a central point, as if something had seeped through the wood from above. The stains spread slowly, a blot of blackness that dripped in thick, oily drops, splattering onto the floor with a sound that echoed through the silence like distant thunder. The drops seemed alive, creeping along the cracks in the floorboards, forming erratic trails that converged back toward the cold spot. The air grew heavier, pressing down like a weight on the chest, making it difficult to breathe. The cold was no longer just a temperature. It was a force pushing outward from that central point, extending its reach like icy tendrils. The atmosphere thickened with an almost electric tension, the kind that made every hair stand on end, sending shivers down the spine. The chill bit deeper, clawing its way into bone, leaving behind a numbness that was more than just physical. It was a cold that reached into the soul. An unseen hand brushed against the curtains, sending them fluttering wildly as if caught in a gust of wind. The frost on the mirror thickened, growing into jagged spikes that seemed to claw at the glass from within. The reflection in the mirror began to warp, the shadows shifting in unnatural ways. Shapes that shouldn't have been there flickered at the edge of perception. Blurred figures, twisting in grotesque motions, moving in time with the pulse of the cold spot. A faint rattling sound came from the sideboard against the far wall. The glass doors vibrated softly, and the old china inside clinked against one another, as if trembling in fear. The rattling grew more insistent, more frenzied, until the doors swung open with a bang, the plates crashing to the floor, shattering into fragments. The shards skittered across the floor, drawn toward the cold spot as if pulled by an invisible magnet. The walls trembled, a low rumble reverberating through the house. The cold was unbearable now, the kind that seeped into the mind, numbing thought, leaving only a hollow sense of dread. The faces in the walls twisted further, their mouths opening in silent screams, eyes wide with eternal horror. The ceiling creaked ominously, the dark stain above the cold spot spreading faster, dripping steadily now, a constant patter that beat like a drum. A deep, resonant hum began to fill the room, vibrating through the floor and into the bones. It was low, almost below the threshold of hearing, but it thrummed with malevolent energy. The vibrations synchronized with the rhythm of the cold spot's pulse, each beat sending out a wave of icy dread that radiated through the house. The temperature plunged further, the frost creeping down the walls, coating every surface in a thin layer of ice. The room had become a frozen tomb, a place where time itself seemed to slow, dragging every second into an eternity. The presence in the cold spot grew stronger, more defined, as if whatever lurked there was feeding off the fear and despair that now saturated the air. Suddenly, the vibrations ceased. The humming stopped, leaving a silence that was deafening in its completeness. The cold spot contracted sharply, pulling all the gathered energy inward, leaving the room in an oppressive, breathless stillness. For a long moment, nothing moved. The frost held, the shadows clung to the corners, and the air remained frigid, but nothing happened. Then, in the center of the cold spot, the floorboards buckled with a loud crack. A jagged split ran down the wood, opening a narrow crevice. The darkness within that crevice was unnatural, not just an absence of light, but a void that seemed to devour everything around it. The split widened slowly, as though something beneath the floor was trying to claw its way out. And just as quickly as it had appeared, the split closed again, sealing itself shut. The frost began to recede. The faces in the walls faded back into the patterns of decay, and the air warmed slightly, but only by a fraction. The cold spot remained, a lingering chill that promised more to come, a threat that hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. The house settled once more into silence, but it was a silence that hummed with dark anticipation, waiting for the next stir of movement, the next breath of cold air that would signal the awakening of whatever malevolent force lay beneath. In the deep, dark recesses of the house, something continued to wait, biding its time. Chapter 5. The Cradle in the Attic. The wind howled through the eaves of the house, rattling the loose shingles and sending shivers down the skeletal beams. The attic was a place forgotten by time, sealed off from the world below by dust and decay. Cobwebs hung like curtains, swaying gently in the draft that whispered through the cracked boards. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and something sour, like the remnants of long-spoiled milk, curdled and festering in the shadows. At the far end of the attic, tucked into the deepest, darkest corner, stood an old wooden cradle. It was small and simple, carved from dark oak, its once polished surface now roughened by years of neglect. The rockers were curved elegantly, designed to glide back and forth smoothly, but time had gnawed at the wood, leaving the cradle with a creak that could set teeth on edge. The mattress inside was yellowed with age, stained with spots that could no longer be identified. The cradle had been abandoned long ago, left to gather dust and memories. Yet despite its neglect, it remained oddly free of the thick layer of grime that covered everything else in the attic. The wood was dry and cracked, but the dust seemed to avoid settling on it, as though it rejected the passage of time. It stood there, untouched, waiting in a pocket of darkness that no light could seem to penetrate. Above, the rafters groaned with the weight of something unseen, the sound resonating through the hollow space like the sighs of a restless sleeper. The shadows twisted and stretched across the floor, pooling in the corners and creeping toward the cradle in slow, deliberate tendrils. The air felt heavy, oppressive, pressing down like a blanket soaked in cold water. The cradle began to move. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a slight tremor, as though responding to the vibrations in the house. But soon, the movement became more pronounced. The rockers scraped against the floor, each back and forth motion producing a sharp creak that cut through the silence like the cry of a rusty hinge. The rhythm was slow, deliberate, as if something was pushing it ever so gently, coaxing it into a steady lullaby. Dust rose from the floor in swirling eddies, carried by a draft that seemed to emerge from nowhere. The air crackled with tension, the hairs on the back of the neck standing at attention as the temperature dropped once more. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound began, echoing through the wooden beams, tap, 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 like tiny fingers drumming on a surface. It wasn't random. It followed the rhythm of the rocking cradle, matching it beat for beat. As the cradle rocked, faint impressions began to appear on the old mattress. Indentations pressed into the fabric, as though tiny hands were reaching up from beneath, gripping at the threadbare cloth. The marks grew deeper, and the cradle rocked faster, driven by an unseen force, a force that grew stronger with each passing second. The mattress dipped further, and the outline of a small body began to take shape, pressing into the fabric with a weight that shouldn't have existed. The creaks grew louder, more strained, as if the very wood of the cradle was protesting against the unnatural force that drove it. The rockers gouged deeper into the floor, leaving grooves that splintered the old boards. The tapping grew more insistent, a frantic rhythm that quickened in time with the cradle's motion. The sound of a soft thud joined the tapping, as if something small and heavy was being dropped repeatedly onto the mattress. The shadows coiled tighter around the cradle, thickening like black smoke, until the entire corner of the attic was enveloped in a void that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. It was as though the darkness was alive, feeding off the fear that thickened the air. The rocking reached a fevered pitch, the cradle now jerking violently back and forth, driven by an unseen fury that sought release. And then, suddenly, the movement stopped. The cradle froze mid-rock, suspended in silence. The tapping ceased, the thudding halted, and the air went still. The attic was plunged into a deathly quiet, broken only by the faint rustle of the wind outside. The shadows clung to the cradle, unmoving, as if holding their breath. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause, as if the house was waiting for something. An event, an arrival, a revelation. Slowly, the cradle began to tilt forward, as if tipped by a gentle hand. The rockers left the floor, and the cradle hung in the air at an unnatural angle, its mouth gaping open like a broken jaw. The mattress sagged, the fabric stretching as something heavy dragged it downward. Then, with a sickening creak, the cradle tipped completely, sending the mattress spilling onto the floor. There, in the dust and grime, lay a small bundle wrapped in tattered cloth. The fabric was stained dark, the color of dried blood, and the bundle twitched faintly, as though something inside was still moving. It was an unnatural motion, jerky, spasmodic, like the twitching of a corpse in its final moments. The cloth unraveled slightly, revealing the brittle outline of tiny fingers curled into a claw-like grasp. The wind outside picked up, howling through the cracks in the walls, rattling the loose boards. The rafters above creaked ominously, vibrating with a sound that was almost a low moan. The bundle twitched again, the cloth falling away to reveal the skeletal remains of a child. Bones blackened and twisted, fused together in unnatural shapes. The empty eye sockets stared upward, hollow and accusing, their darkness deeper than the shadows that filled the attic. The cold deepened, seeping into the marrow, freezing thought and will. The presence in the attic grew stronger, more oppressive, pressing down with an undeniable force. It was a weight that couldn't be shrugged off, a presence that demanded acknowledgement, recognition of the horrors that had taken place within those walls. The shadows around the cradle writhed, pulsating with a malevolent energy, coiling tighter around the skeletal remains. They moved like tendrils, creeping across the floor, reaching out as if to embrace the bones. The air buzzed with a low hum, a vibration that seemed to originate from deep within the house's foundation. It was a sound of old sorrows, ancient grief twisted into something dark and hateful. The attic's walls groaned in response, the wood creaking and straining under the pressure of something vast and unseen. The darkness pressed in closer, suffocating, blotting out what little light remained. The wind outside screamed now, a banshee's wail that reverberated through the house, echoing off the rotting beams and cracked walls. The shadows gathered, swirling in a frenzied dance, centering on the remains in a maelstrom of darkness. And then, with a final, bone-chilling gust, the wind ceased. The attic was left in utter stillness, the silence ringing in the ears like the aftermath of a scream. The cradle, now upright again, sat empty, its rockers barely swaying as the shadows retreated to their corners. The skeletal remains had vanished, leaving only a faint stain on the dusty floorboards, a dark mark that pulsed faintly as if still alive. The air remained cold, but it was the cold of death, a chill that would never lift. The presence lingered, settling into the walls, merging with the very fabric of the house, waiting for the next moment to stir. The attic had become a tomb once more, holding its secrets close, guarding the memories of what had happened there. The cradle creaked one final time, a soft, mournful sound that faded into the darkness. Then silence reigned, heavy and absolute, as the house resumed its patient watch, biding its time until it could release the horrors held within. And somewhere deep within the shadows, the faint echo of a child's cry lingered, twisted by time into a sound no longer human, a wail of despair, anger, and a darkness that would never truly rest. Chapter 6: Whispers in the Walls. The house seemed to breathe with an unnatural cadence, a slow exhale that echoed faintly through the empty halls. Dust floated lazily in the air, suspended in the pale light seeping through the grimy windows. Each room held a silence that was not simply the absence of sound, but an oppressive weight that draped itself over everything like a shroud. Beneath that silence, however, there was a current, a subtle vibration that pulsed through the walls, as if the house itself was humming with the remnants of dark memories. The walls of the house were thick with secrets, old and buried beneath layers of chipped paint and decaying wallpaper. The patterns on the walls had faded into obscurity, the once vibrant colors now mottled and stained. Faint outlines of floral design still lingered, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to shift whenever one's gaze wasn't fixed directly on them. There were places where the wallpaper hung in tattered strips, revealing the cracked plaster beneath, which was etched with strange marks, as though clawed by desperate hands. It started with a faint rustling sound, a barely perceptible noise like the scratching of rats within the walls. It was a subtle, almost dismissible disturbance, but it grew steadily more insistent. The scratching moved through the house, shifting from room to room as if tracing a path known only to the unseen intruder. The noise was relentless, a constant presence that scraped at the edge of sanity, gnawing away like a dull toothache in the mind. The sound crept through the old pipes, reverberating in low, hollow tones that carried through the vents. The wooden floorboards groaned beneath an invisible weight, sagging slightly as if something heavy passed over them. The vibrations grew more distinct, more deliberate, and then came the whispers, soft, murmuring voices indistinct and fleeting, like distant echoes carried on a faint breeze. They were not human voices. They were warped, distorted, stretched thin as though pulled across vast distances of time and space. The whispers emanated from within the walls, filling every crevice, every crack with their dark mutterings. They rose and fell in waves, sometimes a low murmur, sometimes a frantic chattering like a chorus of madmen muttering to themselves. It was impossible to make out any distinct words, but there was an unmistakable malevolence in the tone, a hateful, resentful undertone that seemed to seethe with ancient anger. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with these voices, expanding and contracting subtly with each wave of sound. Shadows lengthened in unnatural ways, stretching across the room as if reaching out to grasp at the air. The house felt alive, its walls a living organism pulsing with dark energy. The vibrations intensified, sending tremors through the floor, making the furniture tremble, the frames on the walls tilt precariously. In the hallway, the wooden paneling groaned as it warped and cracked, widening into deep fissures. From within those cracks oozed a dark, viscous substance, thick and tar-like, dripping slowly down the walls in jagged streaks. The sticky liquid clung to the wood, pooling on the floor, its surface rippling as though disturbed by something unseen moving beneath it. It carried a foul stench, a sickly sweet odor mingled with the scent of rot and decay. The whispers grew louder, more frenzied, overlapping in a chaotic cacophony that seemed to come from all directions at once. They surged and ebbed, carried through the air on currents that swirled and twisted in impossible patterns. The walls themselves pulsed, bulging outward as though the house was swelling with pressure, struggling to contain whatever was stirring within. The wallpaper peeled away in curling strips, exposing more of the ancient plaster beneath, now riddled with deep gouges and cryptic symbols. The hallway grew colder with each passing moment, the temperature dropping to a bone-chilling degree. The cold wasn't natural. It carried an aura of dread, a primal fear that burrowed into the mind and festered there. The lights flickered overhead, the bulbs buzzing with a low, droning hum. A faint, rhythmic tapping began, echoing down the hall, a steady, deliberate beat that seemed to follow the vibrations in the walls. As the tapping grew nearer, the walls themselves seemed to bulge and writhe as though something was trying to force its way through. The cracks widened, more of the dark liquid seeping through in thick rivulets. The whispers took on a desperate edge, as if the voices were pleading, begging for release. There was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air, a buildup of energy that crackled like static electricity. In the center of the hallway, the floorboards began to buckle, warping upward in sharp angles as if pushed from below. The wood splintered with a sharp crack, and the dark substance oozed upward, pooling in a growing puddle. The whispers reached a fever pitch, a chaotic chorus that clawed at the edges of comprehension. Faces began to appear in the wood, ghostly impressions pressing outward from the grain. Twisted, anguished visages with hollow eyes and gaping mouths frozen in silent screams. The walls trembled violently, and from within the deepest cracks came a low, rumbling groan. The house was in agony, straining against the forces tearing it apart from within. The whispers converged into a singular, distorted wail, a sound not of this world, filled with a sorrow and rage that defied comprehension. The liquid on the floor began to bubble, frothing as if it were boiling from some unseen heat source. It spread across the floor, creeping toward the baseboards, where it was absorbed into the walls like water soaking into dry soil. The shadows coiled tighter, twisting into tendrils that slithered along the walls and ceiling, merging with the dark substance until it formed a swirling mass of malevolent energy. The house buckled and groaned, its structure straining as if on the verge of collapse. The air was thick with an oppressive force, pressing down like an invisible hand, squeezing the breath from the lungs. Then, without warning, the whispers ceased. The silence was deafening, a void that sucked all sound from the air. The vibrations stopped, the walls went still, and the shadows retreated into the corners, leaving the hallway in a stark, unsettling stillness. The dark liquid remained, pooled and motionless, its surface gleaming dully in the faint light. The faces in the wood faded back into the grain, leaving only faint impressions that could be dismissed as tricks of the mind. But the house wasn't quiet. Beneath the silence, there was still a faint, almost imperceptible hum, a residual energy that lingered in the air, vibrating just below the threshold of hearing. It was a warning, a promise of what was yet to come. The walls had returned to their original state, but the house had changed. It had absorbed something, become something darker, more malevolent. The air remained cold, and the sense of being watched never left. It was as if the house was now fully awake, its presence seeping into every corner, every crevice. The whispers might have gone silent for now, but they were still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise again. For now, the house settled into its usual silence, but it was the silence of a predator lying in wait, biding its time. The walls were no longer just walls. They had become vessels, conduits for whatever dark force had taken root within. And as the last of the dark liquid was absorbed into the floor, the house exhaled one final, shuddering breath, as if it had fed on the fear it had conjured. Somewhere deep within the bowels of the house, there was movement, a subtle shift in the shadows, a flicker of something ancient stirring. The house was hungry, and it would not be satisfied until it had consumed everything within its grasp. The whispers would return, and when they did, they would be louder, more demanding, more relentless. The house had made its claim. It was only a matter of time before it sought to fulfill it. Chapter 7. The clock strikes at midnight. The old grandfather clock stood at the end of the corridor, a monolith of dark wood and polished brass. Its face was a grim sentinel, tarnished by years of neglect, with hands that moved at a lethargic pace, as if burdened by the weight of time itself. The glass that encased the pendulum was cracked in a spiderweb pattern, distorting the view of the slow, rhythmic swing. Each tick was a hollow thud, resonating through the house like a heartbeat, reverberating off the walls with a dull, echoing persistence. The clock had not struck midnight in years. Something within its ancient mechanics had rusted over, trapping the chimes in silence. Yet on this night, something was different. A strange energy thrummed through the air, awakening old mechanisms, stirring the gears back into motion. The pendulum swung with a deliberate, measured rhythm, ticking off the seconds with a sound that grew louder, sharper with each passing moment. The gears clicked and clattered deep within the clock's heart, a mechanical chorus rising from the depths. The rest of the house seemed to respond in kind. The temperature dropped again, the chill seeping through the floorboards and walls like icy tendrils. The shadows that clung to the corners thickened, deepening until they appeared almost solid, moving with a subtle, fluid grace. The once quiet rooms filled with an unsettling tension, as though every inch of the house was bracing itself for something inevitable, something that had been building over countless years of stillness. As the hour crept toward midnight, the ticking of the clock grew louder, more insistent. The entire house seemed to synchronize with its rhythm. Floorboards creaked in time, old pipes groaned in concert, and the wind outside howled in perfect harmony. The atmosphere grew heavy, pressing down like a suffocating weight, thick with the sense of something about to break free. In the parlor, the shadows swirled and twisted, contorting into shapes that bore the faintest semblance of human forms, elongated limbs, gaunt faces with hollow eyes. They danced along the walls and ceiling, moving in time with the relentless ticking, stretching and shrinking as they passed over the faded wallpaper. The room's furnishings, a moth-eaten armchair, a cracked mirror, a sagging bookshelf, seemed to sag further under the weight of the darkness, as if the very presence of the shadows was leeching the life from them. Dust particles hung suspended in the air, caught in a strange, unnatural stillness, as though time itself had paused. Every sound was amplified. The creak of wood, the distant groan of the walls, the low hum that vibrated beneath it all. The shadows began to gather around the clock, drawn to its ticking like moths to a flame. They clustered at its base, swirling upward in spirals that licked at the cracked glass, drawn toward the brass pendulum that swung with a hypnotic regularity. The clock's face, once covered in grime and tarnish, began to clear, revealing intricate engravings, strange symbols that pulsed with a faint, ghostly light. The numerals, once Roman, had warped into twisted shapes, their edges blurred, as if they were shifting between forms. The minute hand quivered as it inched toward the 12, its movement almost hesitant, as though resisting the inevitable toll of midnight. A deep rumble echoed through the house, shaking dust from the rafters. The walls shuddered, cracks widening in jagged lines that spread like veins. The shadows responded, growing more animated, their forms twisting and coiling with greater urgency. They slithered across the floor like living smoke, reaching out toward the clock as if drawn by some magnetic force. With a final, heavy click, the minute hand reached the 12. The clock struck midnight. The first chime was a low, resonant toll that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the house. It echoed down the corridors, bouncing off the walls in a distorted wave that sent ripples through the air. The shadows convulsed at the sound, recoiling briefly before surging forward with renewed fervor. The pendulum swung wildly, its rhythmic motion now erratic, as though some invisible hand was pushing it beyond its natural pace. The second chime was sharper, more urgent, a sound that cut through the thick atmosphere like a blade. The room shuddered in response, the furniture trembling, the very floor beneath groaning in protest. The walls bowed inward slightly, as if the house itself was being squeezed from within. The crack in the clock's glass spread further, fissures racing across the surface like lightning bolts. The third chime was accompanied by a gust of icy wind that blasted through the house, howling down the hallways, rattling the doors on their hinges. The flames in the old, unused fireplace flickered to life, igniting in a burst of blue flame that cast grotesque shadows across the walls. The shadows danced with feverish intensity, their shapes more defined now. Faces stretched in silent screams, hands reaching out with clawed fingers, eyes empty and soulless. The fourth chime sent the mirrors throughout the house shattering in unison. Glass rained down in glittering shards, each fragment reflecting distorted images, flashes of twisted figures, ghostly apparitions, and glimpses of darkened eyes staring back from impossible angles. The reflections in the broken pieces shifted unnaturally, as if they belonged to another world entirely, a world where time flowed differently, where the laws of reality bent to a darker will. The fifth chime resonated with a deep, mournful tone, the sound of a bell tolling at a funeral. The air grew heavy with the stench of decay, a putrid odor that rose from the very floorboards, as though something long dead was being exhumed. The wallpaper peeled back in long, curling strips, revealing rotting wood and mold-blackened beams. The ceiling sagged ominously, groaning under an invisible weight. The sixth chime was a scream, a shrill, piercing note that rang through the house with such intensity that the walls seemed to vibrate in sympathy. The shadows shrieked in response, their forms writhing in agony, twisting in impossible shapes as they clung to the walls. The temperature plunged even further, frost creeping along the edges of the windows, cracking the glass with a sharp, splintering sound. The seventh chime was a rumble, deep and primal, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very bowels of the earth. The house shook violently, the floorboards buckling and cracking as if they were being torn apart from below. The shadows coalesced into a dense mass at the center of the room, a swirling vortex of darkness that pulsed with a sickly, greenish glow. It throbbed in time with the chimes, growing larger, more defined, as if something within was straining to break free. The eighth chime brought a wave of pressure that crushed the air from the lungs, pressing down like an invisible hand squeezing the life out of the room. The walls seemed to pulse in and out, breathing with the rhythm of the clock's chimes. The shadows began to solidify, taking on tangible forms. Creatures twisted and emaciated, their limbs elongated, their faces mere smears of darkness with eyes that glowed like embers. The ninth chime reverberated through the entire house, causing the foundation to shudder. Dust rained down in thick clouds, and the ceiling above cracked, widening into a gaping fissure. From within that dark void above, tendrils of shadow began to descend, writhing like snakes, reaching for the floor. The vortex at the center of the room pulsed violently, expanding outward as it consumed the light, drawing everything into its inky depths. The 10th chime was a pulse of darkness, an extinguishing of all light, plunging the house into total blackness. In that void, the only sensation was the relentless ticking of the clock, which now beat like a monstrous heart, slow and methodical. The chimes continued to ring out, though they no longer seemed to originate from the clock itself. They came from within the walls, the floor, the ceiling, all around, as if the house had become a living organism echoing the sound. The 11th chime was a final exhalation, a rush of icy wind that swept through the house, snuffing out the last remnants of warmth. The shadows, now fully solid, surged forward, their forms merging into one another, creating a writhing mass that moved with a purpose, drawn to the heart of the vortex. The pressure in the air built to a crescendo, the walls bowing inward as though the house was being crushed from all sides. The 12th and final chime rang out, a sound that transcended hearing, felt more in the bones than the ears. The vortex erupted, spewing forth tendrils of shadow that lashed out, enveloping everything in their path. The clock, now cracked and broken, released a final, agonized creak as its pendulum came to a sudden halt. The gears ground to a stop, the hands frozen at midnight. And then, silence. The darkness receded, leaving the house in a state of eerie calm. The shadows slithered back into the walls, leaving behind faint trails of black soot. The room was left in disarray. Furniture toppled, dust swirling in the air. But the oppressive presence that had filled the house was gone, as if it had retreated into the deepest recesses of the building. The clock stood silent, its face cracked, its hands unmoving. The energy that had animated the house had withdrawn. Chapter 8. The Presence in the Mirror. The mirror in the upstairs bedroom had been covered for years. Draped in a thick, dust-laden cloth, its surface was hidden from view, as though even the light feared what might be reflected within its depths. The cloth, once white, had yellowed with age, and cobwebs clung to its edges. Something about the mirror's presence was unsettling. It was as if the glass held onto the memories of all who had ever gazed into it, trapping fragments of their souls within. The house was quiet after the midnight chimes had finally ceased, but the silence was brittle, ready to crack at any moment. The air hung heavy with the residue of the dark energy that had flooded through every room, settling now in the mirror's forgotten corner. The cloth stirred slightly, though there was no breeze, as if disturbed by a faint whisper, a soft exhalation from within the room itself. A chill radiated from the mirror, seeping into the walls, creeping along the floorboards, and curling like cold fingers around the edges of the bed. The mirror had once been grand, a relic from a time when the house was alive with laughter and music. Its ornate wooden frame was carved with intricate designs, twisting vines, interlocking leaves, and symbols that now seemed sinister in their looping patterns. The wood was dark, nearly black, polished to a sheen that had long since dulled. Yet beneath the dust, the frame still held an air of elegance, a relic of forgotten grandeur that contrasted sharply with the gloom that now filled the room. As the night deepened, the shadows thickened, pooling at the corners and creeping up the walls like living things. They stretched, grew longer, their edges frayed like tattered cloth. They were drawn toward the mirror, gathering around its shrouded form, as if waiting for something, some signal, some cue to awaken whatever lay dormant behind the glass. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping with each passing minute, and the silence took on a weight that pressed down on everything, as though the air itself had grown dense with the passage of unseen forces. Without warning, the cloth slipped off the mirror. It didn't flutter or drift gently to the floor. It dropped abruptly, as if yanked by an invisible hand. Dust swirled in the air, disturbed by the sudden movement, and for a moment, nothing happened. The mirror stood exposed, its surface dull, reflecting nothing but darkness. The room's furnishings, an old bed, a dresser, and a wardrobe, were barely visible in the dim light, their outlines blurred and indistinct. But then, something stirred within the glass. At first, it was just a faint ripple, a distortion like heat waves rising from asphalt on a summer's day. The reflection in the mirror quivered, the image warping and bending as though the glass itself was liquid, shifting and flowing in impossible ways. The darkness in the room seemed to gather within the mirror's depths, coalescing into murky shadows that writhed just beneath the surface. Faint shapes began to emerge, blurs of motion, indistinct figures that twisted and turned, as if struggling to break free. The shadows in the room responded in kind, drawn toward the mirror's surface as if pulled by a magnetic force. They gathered along the floor, creeping upward, slithering like ink spreading across water. The glass trembled, shuddering in its frame, emitting a faint humming sound, a low, almost inaudible drone that set the teeth on edge. The mirror was no longer a mere object. It had become a portal, a window into something beyond, a place where the rules of reality no longer held sway. The figures in the mirror grew clearer, their outlines sharpening into grotesque forms. Faces appeared, twisted, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare out from some unimaginable void. Their mouths gaped open in silent screams, distorted by the rippling surface of the glass. Their expressions were etched with agony, desperation, and a deep, unending sorrow. They were not simply reflections. They were remnants, echoes of something that had been trapped within the mirror for an eternity. The room's temperature plummeted further, frost forming along the edges of the mirror's frame, creeping outward like crystalline tendrils. The frost spread along the walls, cracking the plaster, leaving jagged patterns that resembled claw marks. The faces in the mirror pressed closer to the surface, their expressions growing more desperate as they clawed at the glass, their hands leaving smudges of darkness that spread like ink stains. The glass flexed inward slightly, as if it were softening, allowing the figures to press against it, straining to emerge. The shadows in the room began to move of their own accord, circling the mirror in slow, deliberate patterns. They twisted into spirals, merging and separating, forming abstract shapes that writhed with dark energy. The humming from the mirror grew louder, a resonant vibration that pulsed in time with the movement of the shadows. The entire room felt as though it was tilting, swaying gently, as if the walls were slowly closing in. Then, from deep within the mirror, a shape began to emerge. It started as a dark spot in the center of the glass, a smudge that slowly expanded outward. The spot grew darker, denser, until it became a swirling mass of shadow, twisting and writhing like a living thing. From within that darkness, two pale, lifeless eyes appeared, cold, empty, and devoid of humanity. The rest of the figure began to take shape: a gaunt face, skeletal hands, a body that seemed to stretch and elongate as it pressed against the glass. It was no longer a reflection. It was something else, something that should not exist within the confines of reality. The figure pressed harder against the surface, the glass bowing outward as though it were thin as skin. The shadows in the room pulsed in response, surging forward as the figure's hands began to push through the glass, fingertips emerging first, followed by long, spindly fingers that clawed at the air. The mirror groaned under the strain, the glass creaking as cracks began to spiderweb across its surface. The humming intensified, becoming a high-pitched whine that vibrated through the very walls. Suddenly, the glass shattered. The sound was deafening, a sharp, piercing crack that echoed through the house. Shards of glass exploded outward, scattering across the floor in glittering fragments. But there was no reflection in those shards, only darkness, a void that seemed to swallow the light itself. The figure from the mirror stepped forward, emerging fully into the room, its form twisted and malformed, as though it had been stretched and distorted by the journey through the glass. It moved with unnatural grace, its limbs bending at odd angles, its head tilting in slow, jerking motions. The shadows in the room converged on it, swirling around it like a vortex, feeding it, strengthening it. The frost on the walls spread faster, crackling as it grew, the air thick with the smell of decay and something else, something foul and ancient, like a tomb left undisturbed for centuries. The figure's eyes were fixed on the room, its gaze cold and unfeeling, its presence suffocating in its malevolence. The mirror, now shattered, was silent. Its frame was empty, save for the remnants of glass clinging to the edges. The room was plunged into near-total darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the frost and the sickly greenish aura that clung to the figure. The walls groaned, and the floor creaked beneath the weight of an unseen force pressing down, as though the very house was straining to contain what had been released. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow, deliberate, each footfall sending a pulse of dread through the room. The shadows recoiled slightly, as if bowing to the creature, before surging forward again, wrapping around it like tendrils. The figure raised a skeletal hand, fingers outstretched, as if searching for something, sensing the presence of life, of warmth, in the otherwise deadened space. The room itself seemed to pulse with dark energy, the walls warping and twisting as the figure's influence spread. The frost spread further, creeping along the floor, climbing the walls, cracking the windows. The shadows whispered in a language that was not meant to be understood by mortal minds, disjointed syllables, fragmented words that carried a resonance of ancient curses and forgotten rituals. Then, without warning, the figure turned its gaze back to the empty mirror frame. It moved toward it, its form dissolving into tendrils of shadow, slipping back into the darkness from which it had emerged. The shadows followed, retreating into the corners, the frost receding as quickly as it had appeared. The room grew still again, the air thick with the aftermath of whatever had transpired. The shards of glass lay scattered on the floor, each one reflecting only darkness. The mirror, now empty, stood silent once more. But the presence remained. It lingered, unseen yet felt, a dark stain upon the very fabric of the room. The walls seemed to breathe with it, expanding and contracting in shallow, rhythmic pulses. The mirror, though shattered, held onto the residue of what had been released. A malignant energy that now clung to the house, seeping into every crevice, every shadow. The house had changed. The presence was no longer confined to the mirror. It was everywhere, in the walls, in the floors, in the air itself. The darkness had taken root, and the house was alive with it, a living entity bound to the malevolence that had been unleashed. The night was not over, and whatever was now free within the staircase loomed in the center of the house, winding upward in a slow, spiraling curve. Chapter 9. The Stairs That Creak in the Dark. Its wooden steps were worn from countless footsteps, edges rounded smooth by the passage of time. Each board was aged and splintering, stained dark with the weight of decades, creaking under even the lightest touch. The banister, once polished and gleaming, was now dulled and chipped, cold to the touch, its intricate carvings obscured by layers of grime. The steps rose into the shadows above, vanishing into the darkness of the upper floor where the air grew thicker, more oppressive. The house had settled into an uneasy silence after the events of the previous night. The broken mirror, the echoes of chimes, the presence that had crept out of the glass, all left behind a residue that clung to the walls, a sense of something not entirely banished. But it was the staircase, the very heart of the house, that now seemed most alive, most aware. It was as if the steps themselves were waiting, biding their time, attuned to every breath, every movement, every faintest stir of life. The shadows on the first floor deepened as the evening drew in. Light from the setting sun filtered weakly through grime-covered windows, casting long, distorted patterns across the floor. Dust hung in the air, caught in those fading beams, suspended like motes of ash in a dying fire. The walls seemed to swell inward slightly, the darkness in the corners growing denser, more impenetrable. The entire house felt poised on the edge of something. Anticipation, dread, perhaps both. The first creak came just after dusk. It was subtle at first, a soft groan that rose from deep within the wood. The sound was faint, almost indistinguishable from the usual noises of an old house settling. But then it came again, louder this time. A sharp, splintering crack that echoed down the hallway like a snapped bone. The creaking continued, each step groaning in succession as if someone, or something, was ascending the stairs, though the shadows showed no movement, no figure to match the sound. The house held its breath. The creaking intensified, growing rhythmic, a slow, deliberate ascent, each step timed with a hollow thud, as though an unseen weight was pressing down on the boards. The banister shuddered slightly, trembling as the pressure moved upward, inching closer to the top floor. The sound grew more pronounced, resonating through the floorboards, vibrating along the walls, until it was impossible to tell if it was coming from the stairs themselves or from within the very bones of the house. The darkness at the top of the stairs thickened, swirling as though alive, twisting into formless shapes that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. A faint, almost imperceptible hum accompanied the movement, a vibration in the air that set the teeth on edge. The steps continued to groan, the creaking now a constant rhythm, moving with agonizing slowness, as if whatever was climbing the stairs was in no hurry. An inevitable approach, relentless and patient. On the first floor, the shadows lengthened, creeping outward from the corners and pooling along the walls like ink spreading across paper. They moved with a strange, fluid grace, as if drawn by some unseen current. The temperature in the hallway dropped, the chill radiating from the base of the stairs, spreading outward in tendrils that reached into every room. The creaking continued, each step louder than the last, until it felt as though the very air was reverberating with the sound. The banister groaned again, the wood creaking under the strain as the unseen force reached the midpoint of the staircase. The shadows on the walls pulsed, expanding and contracting in time with the sound, as if breathing in rhythm with the slow, measured ascent. Dust drifted from the ceiling, shaken loose by the vibrations, settling in soft, silent heaps on the floor below. The house seemed to groan in sympathy, every crevice, every joint, resonating with the oppressive weight pressing down from above. The air grew thick, almost stifling, as though every breath was drawn through layers of unseen mist. The darkness at the top of the stairs rippled, the shadows twisting into elongated forms, vague silhouettes that stretched and wavered before dissolving back into the gloom. The creaking grew louder, more insistent, as the steps drew closer to the top. The banister shivered again, the wood splintering under the pressure, as if something with great strength was gripping it, dragging itself upward with deliberate, unhurried movements. At the base of the stairs, the shadows had taken on a life of their own. They slithered across the floor, climbing the walls, reaching out toward the steps with long, claw-like tendrils. The once faint hum had grown into a low, resonant drone, vibrating deep within the walls, as if some hidden machinery had been awakened, grinding and whirring with dark purpose. The creaking now reverberated through the entire house, a series of rhythmic cracks and groans that seemed to come from every direction at once. The presence that had once been confined to the mirror had spread, seeping into every corner, every shadow, saturating the air with its malevolence. The walls seemed to bulge inward slightly, as though the house itself was being warped, twisted by the weight of whatever was ascending the stairs. The creaking reached a crescendo as the unseen force neared the top, the sound now a constant barrage of snapping, groaning wood, as if the very staircase was struggling to hold itself together. And then, the creaking stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, thick, oppressive, the kind of silence that presses down on the chest and fills the ears with a dull, echoing hum. The shadows froze, holding their twisted positions on the walls, as if caught in mid-motion. The air hung heavy, saturated with the presence that now lingered just out of sight, just beyond the reach of light. The house felt as though it was teetering on the brink of something, poised at the edge of an unseen abyss. For a long moment, nothing moved. The air was still, the shadows motionless, the creaking silenced. But the tension was unbearable, a palpable pressure that seemed to compress the very space within the house. The staircase, now silent, felt like a coiled spring, ready to snap at any moment, releasing whatever force had been creeping upward. The darkness at the top of the stairs was impenetrable, a void that swallowed all light, all warmth, leaving only the faintest hint of motion within its depths. Then, from the darkness above, a single, muffled thud echoed through the house. The sound was soft, barely more than a faint tap, but it resonated with a deep, hollow tone that sent shivers through the floorboards. The thud was followed by another, then another, a slow, deliberate rhythm, as though something was tapping on the floor with heavy, deliberate intent. The shadows at the base of the stairs rippled, drawn upward by the sound, writhing like serpents as they ascended toward the source of the noise. The thudding grew louder, each tap a dull, resonant note that reverberated through the house. It was a sound that carried weight, an impact that shivered through the walls, vibrating through the banister, sending tremors along the staircase. The darkness at the top of the stairs shifted, swirling in thick, inky waves, as though something immense and ancient was stirring within its depths. The staircase, silent for so long, shuddered with the force of the unseen presence pressing down from above. The air grew colder, the chill biting into the skin, leaving a faint frost on the wooden banister. The shadows on the walls pulsed, growing more erratic in their movements, twisting and contorting as they followed the rhythm of the thudding above. Dust fell from the ceiling in soft cascades, disturbed by the vibrations that now rattled through the house. The presence reached the top of the stairs. The darkness there condensed, coiling inward like a storm gathering strength, its form indistinct yet suffused with a terrible weight. The thudding ceased, replaced by a low, rumbling hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The shadows froze, quivering as they awaited the next move, poised at the edge of some unseen revelation. And then, slowly, deliberately, the presence began to descend. The first step was accompanied by a creak that cut through the silence like a knife. The sound was deep, resonant, a groan that echoed down the staircase, vibrating through the banister and the floorboards. The air grew heavier with each step, the pressure mounting as the unseen force drew closer, descending with excruciating slowness. The shadows followed, slithering down the walls, pooling at the base of the stairs, drawn like moths to a flame. The presence moved with deliberate, methodical precision, each step marked by a low creak that reverberated through the house. The darkness at the top of the stairs twisted, stretching downward, as though the void itself was reaching toward the lower floors. The shadows grew more restless, their movements frantic, swirling in chaotic patterns as they converged on the base of the stairs. The presence was halfway down when the banister cracked. The wood split with a sharp, splintering sound, sending fragments scattering across the floor. The force pressing down from above was immense, warping the very structure of the house, twisting the staircase beneath it. The creaking grew louder, more insistent, as the unseen entity drew closer. Its form, now palpable in the cellar, was a realm of shadow and decay, a forgotten part of the house that had long been relegated to the dark recesses of memory. Chapter 10. The Descent into the Cellar. It lay beneath the floorboards of the main house, accessible only by a narrow, winding staircase that led down into its depths. The stairs were steep and treacherous, each step coated with a thick layer of dust that had settled over years of neglect. The air was heavy with the smell of dampness and mold, a musty odor that clung to everything, mingling with the faint, acrid scent of something long decayed. The cellar door was old and weathered, its wood warped and swollen from years of exposure to the elements. It creaked ominously when pushed open, the hinges groaning in protest as if resisting the intrusion into its dark sanctum. The door was heavy, its surface covered in cracks and splinters, a testament to the passage of time. Beyond it lay a world of darkness, the light from the hallway barely penetrating the black void that stretched below. The descent began in near total darkness. The narrow staircase twisted downward, each step a treacherous journey through layers of dust and grime. The wooden steps were worn and uneven, some cracked and splintered, the edges curling upward in jagged lines. The handrail, where it existed, was barely more than a series of rotting wooden slats, their smooth surface long eroded by moisture and time. As the descent continued, the darkness grew thicker, more oppressive. The faint light from above dwindled, swallowed by the yawning void that seemed to stretch endlessly downward. The air grew colder, each breath drawn feeling heavier, laden with the weight of years of stale, stagnant air. The shadows clung to the walls, black and shifting, as if animated by some unseen force. The faint sounds of dripping water and the occasional scurry of unseen creatures added to the sense of unease that pervaded the space. At the bottom of the stairs lay the cellar itself, a vast, cavernous space that seemed to extend beyond the bounds of the house. The ceiling was low, the rafters sagging under the weight of accumulated debris. The walls were rough-hewn stone, damp and slick with moisture, their surface covered in patches of black mold and mildew. The floor was uneven, a mix of cracked concrete and soil, littered with old, forgotten remnants of a past long gone. The air was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional drip of water falling from the ceiling, the sound echoing in the stillness. The darkness was nearly absolute, broken only by the faint, flickering light of a single, long-forgotten bulb hanging from a chain in the center of the room. The light was weak, casting long, wavering shadows that danced across the walls, creating a disorienting effect as the darkness seemed to come alive with movement. In one corner of the cellar, half buried under a pile of old, rotting crates, was a large wooden chest. Its surface was covered in layers of dust and grime, the once ornate carvings obscured by years of neglect. The chest was locked, the heavy iron lock rusted and corroded, the key long since lost. The wood was splintered and warped, the lid slightly ajar as though something within had once tried to escape. The rest of the cellar was filled with discarded furniture, broken and covered in cobwebs, and various other forgotten objects. There were old trunks, their leather straps rotted away, and piles of dusty books and papers, their contents yellowed and brittle. The remnants of once-loved possessions lay scattered across the floor, abandoned to the ravages of time. The air was thick with the smell of decay, a mingling of damp wood and mold that clung to the senses. The shadows in the cellar seemed to move with a life of their own, undulating and shifting as if drawn to some unseen source of energy. They swirled around the corners of the room, creeping along the walls and pooling in the recesses, their forms indistinct and ever-changing. The darkness seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that was both unsettling and hypnotic. As time passed, the cellar's oppressive atmosphere grew more intense. The light from the bulb flickered intermittently, casting erratic shadows that shifted with every tremor of the chain. The darkness seemed to grow denser, thicker, as though it were a living entity, drawing in the light and warmth from the space. The walls, coated in a slick sheen of moisture, appeared to pulse with an unseen energy, the mold and mildew forming patterns that seemed to writhe and shift in the dim light. The heavy silence was occasionally broken by the sound of scurrying feet, a faint rustling that seemed to come from all directions at once. It was as if the very darkness of the cellar was alive, teeming with unseen creatures that moved in the blackness. The sound of dripping water became more pronounced, each drop echoing like a heartbeat in the stillness, its rhythm steady and relentless. The wooden chest in the corner remained untouched, its surface growing colder as the night wore on. The air around it seemed to thicken, a faint shimmer of energy surrounding it as if it were a focal point of some dark force. The shadows in the cellar converged around the chest, their forms twisting and writhing as though drawn to its presence. The darkness seemed to deepen, wrapping itself around the chest like a shroud, the faint light from the bulb failing to penetrate the suffocating gloom. The oppressive atmosphere continued to build, the air growing colder with each passing moment. The shadows, once animated, now seemed to lie in wait, their movements becoming more deliberate and purposeful. The cellar felt as though it were holding its breath, the entire space poised on the edge of some momentous event, a sense of impending dread hanging heavy in the air. As the night reached its zenith, the temperature in the cellar plummeted, a frigid cold seeping into every corner. The air became crisp and biting, each breath visible in the dim light. The shadows coalesced around the chest, their forms merging into a single, undulating mass of darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The light from the bulb flickered more erratically, casting strange, distorted shapes on the walls as if the darkness itself was trying to escape from the confines of the room. The wooden chest began to shift, its surface vibrating with a low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from within. The iron lock, corroded and rusted, creaked as though straining against some unseen force. The chest shuddered, its lid lifting slowly, creaking open with a groan that echoed through the cellar. The darkness around it grew denser, swirling in a hypnotic dance as though drawn to the chest's emerging contents. As the lid swung open, the shadows seemed to writhe in anticipation. The air grew colder still, a biting chill that swept through the room, causing the light from the bulb to flicker violently. The contents of the chest were obscured by a thick veil of darkness, their shapes indistinct and shrouded in a murky fog. The shadows reached out toward the chest, their forms stretching and distorting as they sought to envelop whatever lay within. The chest's contents remained hidden, the darkness swallowing them up, rendering them invisible to the faint light. The oppressive silence was broken only by the soft, rhythmic thudding of the chest's movements and the relentless dripping of water from the ceiling. The shadows seemed to pulse with a dark energy, growing more intense as the chest continued to open, the very air vibrating with an otherworldly force. As the chest finally came to rest, the darkness around it seemed to consolidate, wrapping itself tightly around the contents. The oppressive atmosphere grew heavier, more suffocating, as though the very air had become saturated with the malign energy that emanated from the chest. The shadows converged, pooling in the corners of the room, their forms swirling in chaotic patterns that defied comprehension. The light from the bulb flickered one last time before going out, plunging the cellar into absolute darkness. The shadows seemed to surge forward, filling the space with a palpable sense of malevolence. The temperature plummeted, the cold becoming nearly unbearable, a stark contrast to the thick, suffocating warmth that had preceded it. The darkness was complete, the air heavy with a tangible dread that seemed to press down on everything. In the blackness, the only sound was the relentless drip of water, each drop falling into the void with a dull, rhythmic plop. The cellar was a place of unutterable gloom, the darkness so absolute that it felt as though it could swallow the very soul. The wooden chest, now closed once more, stood as a silent sentinel in the void, its contents hidden from view, its secrets buried deep within the oppressive darkness. The presence that had awakened in the house seemed to have found a new home in the cellar, its dark influence spreading outward, saturating the very walls with its malevolent energy. The shadows, once restless, now lay in wait, coiling around the chest like a living shroud, their forms merging with the encroaching darkness. The cellar was a realm of dread and decay, its silence heavy with the weight of unseen forces that moved and breathed within the blackened void. The night wore on, the oppressive atmosphere unchanged, the cellar remaining a place of profound darkness. The shadows continued to writhe and twist, the air thick with an ancient, unspoken menace. The presence in the cellar was a silent, watchful entity, its influence pervasive, its malevolence palpable in the heavy, suffocating gloom. And so, the descent into the cellar had become a journey into the heart of darkness itself, a place where the shadows reigned supreme, and the unseen forces of malevolence lay in wait, their presence felt but never seen. The chest, locked and shrouded in darkness, remained a silent testament to the secrets it held, its contents forever hidden from view, its influence a dark stain on the soul of the house. Chapter 11. The Haunting Echoes. The house's atmosphere had shifted once again, the oppressive weight of the cellar's darkness lingering and spreading through the upper floors. The once familiar spaces had become foreign, their comfort eroded by the unseen forces that now permeated every corner. The halls, once bright and welcoming, had grown dim and foreboding, their shadows stretching long and distorted as the light from outside grew feeble and pale. The first floor felt particularly altered. The living room, with its faded armchairs and old-fashioned decor, seemed to hold its breath, the very air laden with an uneasy stillness. The dust motes that floated lazily in the weak light were now joined by strange, dark wisps that flickered and danced in the corners of the room, moving with a life of their own. The old grandfather clock, a relic of a bygone era, stood silent in its place, its ticking having ceased long ago. Its once reliable chimes had faded into silence, leaving only the occasional, disconcerting thud of its pendulum as it shifted ever so slightly. The windows, once clear and bright, were now covered in a fine layer of grime and cobwebs. The light that filtered through was diffused and weak, casting a sallow, sickly hue over the room. The curtains hung heavy and still, their fabric thick with dust. Outside, the sky was a leaden gray, clouds roiling in a thick, oppressive mass that seemed to press down on the house, adding to the sense of dread that now pervaded the space. Upstairs, the bedrooms had taken on an unsettling quality. The walls, adorned with old wallpaper now peeling and discolored, seemed to close in on themselves, the patterns twisting and warping in the dim light. The beds, once neatly made, were now rumpled and disheveled, as though someone had tossed them aside in a fit of restless sleep. The silence in these rooms was profound, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath, each sound amplified in the stillness. The house's attic was a place of even greater mystery, accessed through a narrow, winding staircase hidden behind a trapdoor. It was a space of dust and shadows, its air thick with the smell of old, forgotten things. The light in the attic was scarce, filtered through a single, small window that let in only a feeble glimmer. The wooden rafters were dark and gnarled, their surfaces covered in cobwebs that hung like ghostly veils. The attic was cluttered with old trunks, boxes, and forgotten belongings, their contents obscured by a heavy layer of dust. Among the clutter, there was an old rocking chair, its wood darkened with age, its seat threadbare. It stood in the center of the attic, as though waiting for someone to come and sit in it. The chair was positioned facing the small window, and the shadows cast by the sparse light created eerie, shifting shapes on the walls. The air in the attic felt colder, almost freezing, the chill seeping into the bones of anyone who ventured up there. The presence in the house seemed to be drawn to this space, the attic becoming a focal point for its dark energy. The air grew heavier, the silence more pronounced, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The shadows in the attic became more pronounced, their movements more deliberate and calculated. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, closing in around the rocking chair with an almost palpable intent. The house, once a place of comfort and safety, had become a maze of shadows and whispers. The walls, now covered in creeping black mold, seemed to breathe with a life of their own, their surfaces rippling as though they were alive. The air was thick and heavy, the temperature fluctuating wildly, creating a disorienting effect that left the inhabitants feeling uneasy and unsettled. As the night fell, the house seemed to come alive with an unsettling energy. The darkness outside grew deeper, the sky a swirling mass of storm clouds that crackled with distant thunder. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it the faint, mournful cries of something unseen. The house seemed to shudder under the force of the wind, the very foundation vibrating with an eerie resonance. The shadows in the house grew darker, more oppressive. They moved with a life of their own, swirling and coalescing into dark, indistinct shapes that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The air was filled with a low, almost imperceptible hum, a resonance that seemed to come from deep within the walls. The sound was both unsettling and hypnotic, creating a disorienting effect that left those within the house feeling trapped in a nightmare. The attic, in particular, seemed to be the epicenter of this strange phenomenon. The rocking chair, with its creaky, time-worn wood, began to move on its own. The motion was slow and deliberate, the chair rocking back and forth in an eerie, rhythmic pattern. The shadows in the attic seemed to respond to the movement, swirling around the chair in a frenzied dance. The rocking chair's motion grew more erratic, its creaks louder and more insistent. The air around it grew colder, the temperature dropping sharply as though the very essence of the house was being drawn toward it. The shadows on the walls writhed and twisted, their shapes becoming more defined and sinister as the chair continued its ghostly motion. In the rooms below, the atmosphere grew heavier, the sense of dread intensifying. The once familiar spaces were now shrouded in an oppressive darkness, the air thick with an unsettling silence. The shadows seemed to stretch and elongate, their forms growing more grotesque and contorted as they moved across the walls. The presence that had taken hold of the house seemed to be growing more powerful, its influence spreading to every corner. The darkness was no longer confined to the shadows but had become a living entity, its presence felt in every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of light. The house itself seemed to be reacting to this malevolent force, its very structure shifting and warping under the strain. The attic, with its eerie rocking chair and oppressive shadows, was the focal point of this growing darkness. The air in the attic was thick with a palpable sense of dread, the temperature dropping to an unbearable chill. The shadows moved with purpose, their forms coalescing around the rocking chair as though drawn to it by some unseen force. As the night wore on, the intensity of the haunting grew. The rocking chair's motion became more frenzied, its creaks louder and more insistent. The shadows seemed to come alive, their movements erratic and chaotic. The air in the attic was filled with a low, resonant hum, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the house. The night wore on, the house trapped in a state of eerie, unsettling stillness. The shadows continued their restless dance, the rocking chair's motion becoming more erratic and frenetic. The air was thick with an overwhelming sense of dread, the temperature plummeting to an almost unbearable cold. The presence in the house had become a dark, oppressive force, its influence felt in every creak, every flicker of light. The haunting echoes of the house grew louder, more insistent. The darkness seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, its presence felt in every corner, every shadow. The rocking chair continued its ghostly motion, its creaks resonating through the attic as the shadows danced around it in a twisted, grotesque ballet. And so, the house remained a place of unutterable gloom, its silence heavy with the weight of unseen forces that moved and breathed within its darkened walls. The presence that had taken hold of the house was relentless, its influence spreading to every corner, every shadow. The darkness had become a living entity, its malevolence palpable in the very air, the very structure of the house. The haunting echoes continued their relentless march, the house a place of eerie, unsettling dread, trapped in the grip of an unending night. Chapter 12. The Distorted Reflections. The house's atmosphere had transformed into an even deeper realm of dread. The oppressive darkness seemed to seep into every corner, every surface, altering the very fabric of reality within its walls. The once familiar rooms had taken on a new, unsettling quality, their dimensions twisted and distorted as if seen through a veil of shadow. The hallway on the second floor had become a maze of shifting shadows. The walls, lined with old, faded wallpaper, appeared to undulate and warp, their once straight patterns now curling and distorting. The floorboards creaked underfoot, each sound amplified by the oppressive silence that hung heavy in the air. The light from the single, dimly flickering bulb in the ceiling seemed to fail in penetrating the darkness, casting long, erratic shadows that twisted and contorted in a disorienting dance. In one of the bedrooms, a large, antique mirror stood propped against the wall, its ornate frame darkened by years of neglect. The glass was cracked and streaked with grime, its surface tarnished and dull. The mirror, once a reflection of normalcy, had become a portal to the house's darker elements. The reflection it cast was no longer a simple image, but a distorted tableau that shifted and shimmered with an unsettling life of its own. The mirror's surface was covered with an eerie, foggy sheen, the reflections within it wavering as though seen through a veil of mist. The image of the room in the mirror appeared to be slightly out of sync with the real space, the furniture and objects reflected in it arranged differently from their actual positions. The shadows in the reflection moved independently, swirling and merging in grotesque patterns that defied logic and reason. The reflection in the mirror became more active as the night progressed. The furniture appeared to shift and rearrange itself, the objects on the shelves and tables changing places in a disorienting fashion. The shadows within the mirror grew darker, their movements more pronounced and erratic. The room in the mirror seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, its reflection warping and bending in response to some unseen force. The bed in the mirrored reflection was now a focal point of eerie activity. The covers, once neatly arranged, now appeared to be tossed and tangled as though someone had been thrashing about in their sleep. The shadows around the bed writhed and twisted, their forms elongating and distorting in the dim light. The mirror's reflection captured every movement, every shift in the room, amplifying the sense of unease and dread. The movements of the shadows grew more pronounced, their forms taking on grotesque, monstrous shapes that seemed to reach out from the mirror. The air around the mirror grew colder, a chill that seeped into the bones, creating an unbearable contrast to the stifling heat of the rest of the house. The shadows in the reflection began to coalesce into more defined shapes, their features becoming more sinister and malevolent. In the kitchen, a similar distortion took place. The old, wooden cabinets and countertops seemed to warp and twist, their surfaces bending and curving as though affected by some unseen force. The reflections in the kitchen's large window were no longer clear but filled with dark, shifting shapes that moved with an unnatural fluidity. The shadows in the reflection seemed to swirl and coalesce, creating an almost hypnotic effect. The appliances in the kitchen appeared to malfunction in the mirror's reflection, their movements jerky and erratic. The refrigerator's door swung open and shut on its own, its contents shifting and rearranging in a chaotic manner. The stove's burners flared to life intermittently, casting erratic bursts of light and shadow that danced across the room. The reflections of the kitchen were alive with a disturbing energy, their movements creating an unsettling atmosphere. In the bathroom, the distortions were even more pronounced. The mirror above the sink was now a swirling mass of foggy, shifting shapes, its surface obscured by a thick, dark mist. The reflection of the room seemed to warp and bend, the objects within it becoming elongated and distorted. The shadows in the bathroom mirror grew more pronounced, their movements synchronized with the shifting patterns on the surface. The bathtub's reflection was particularly unsettling. The water within it appeared to churn and bubble, as though disturbed by some unseen force. The tiles on the walls seemed to shift and warp, their patterns merging and blending into a disorienting mosaic. The shadows in the bathroom mirror took on grotesque, nightmarish forms, their shapes twisting and writhing in a grotesque dance. Throughout the house, the mirrors and reflective surfaces had become conduits for the malevolent presence that had taken hold. The reflections were no longer mere images but living, breathing distortions of reality. The shadows and distortions within them seemed to grow more pronounced, their presence creating an ever-deepening sense of dread and unease. The house itself seemed to respond to the changes in the reflections. The walls and floors appeared to warp and twist, their dimensions growing increasingly distorted as though they were mirroring the chaos within the mirrors. The air grew colder, the oppressive atmosphere thickening with each passing moment. The once familiar rooms had become unsettling, their normalcy replaced by a nightmarish tableau of shadows and distortions. In the hallways, the flickering light bulbs seemed to reflect the chaotic energy of the mirrors. The light cast long, shifting shadows that merged and twisted with the reflections in the mirrors, creating a disorienting effect that made it difficult to discern reality from illusion. The shadows moved with a life of their own, their forms elongating and warping in an eerie dance that defied logic and reason. The presence in the house had grown stronger, its influence spreading through every reflective surface. The distortions in the mirrors had become more intense, their effects creating an ever-deepening sense of unease. The reflections seemed to take on a life of their own, their movements growing more pronounced and sinister. In the darkness of the house, the oppressive atmosphere continued to build. The once familiar spaces had become unrecognizable, their dimensions twisted and warped by the malevolent presence that now pervaded every corner. The mirrors, once innocent objects of reflection, had become windows into a nightmarish realm of shadows and distortions. The air was thick with an overwhelming sense of dread, the temperature fluctuating wildly as though affected by the unseen forces at work. The shadows in the mirrors seemed to pulse with a dark energy, their movements creating an unsettling rhythm that reverberated through the house. The reflections were no longer mere images but living, breathing distortions of reality, their presence creating an ever-deepening sense of fear and apprehension. As the night continued, the distortions in the mirrors grew more intense. The reflections seemed to merge with the shadows in the house, their movements becoming more chaotic and unpredictable. The once familiar spaces had become a maze of shifting shapes and eerie distortions, the reality within the house bending and warping under the influence of the malevolent presence. The mirrors had become a gateway to a nightmarish realm, their reflections capturing the dark energy that had taken hold of the house. The shadows and distortions within them seemed to grow more pronounced, their presence creating an unsettling atmosphere that left the inhabitants feeling trapped in a waking nightmare. The house, once a place of comfort and safety, had become a realm of unutterable dread, its reflections a haunting reminder of the malevolent forces at work. And so, the house remained a place of eerie, unsettling distortions, its reflections capturing the malevolent presence that had taken hold. The shadows and distortions within the mirrors seemed to grow more intense, their movements creating a disorienting effect that left the inhabitants feeling lost and disoriented. The night wore on, the house a realm of twisted reflections and distorted reality, trapped in the grip of an unending nightmare. Chapter 13. The Relentless Descent. The house, now steeped in an almost tangible darkness, seemed to have settled into a state of perpetual twilight. The once bright and welcoming spaces were now a collection of twisted shadows and oppressive silence. Each room had become a reflection of the malevolent energy that pervaded the house, a dark mirror to the reality that once was. The descending spiral staircase in the grand foyer, once an elegant feature of the house, had become a sinister conduit of despair. The wooden steps, now warped and uneven, creaked ominously underfoot. The staircase, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, seemed to stretch endlessly downward, its shadows twisting and elongating in the wavering light. The once polished railing was now darkened and splintered, its surface marred by years of neglect and decay. The walls of the staircase were covered in peeling wallpaper, their once ornate patterns now faded and torn. The air in the stairwell was thick with dust and a musty odor, the atmosphere oppressive and heavy. The temperature seemed to drop noticeably as one descended, the chill penetrating through layers of clothing and leaving an uncomfortable, numbing sensation. As one ventured deeper into the bowels of the house, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The walls appeared to close in, their surfaces darkened and coated with grime. The shadows seemed to take on a life of their own, swirling and coalescing into grotesque shapes that danced menacingly in the dim light. The stairs themselves seemed to pulse with a dark energy, each step feeling as though it were dragging the traveler deeper into the abyss. The basement, which had once been a mundane storage area, now exuded an air of foreboding. The old wooden beams that supported the ceiling were darkened with moisture and mold, their surfaces covered in creeping black tendrils of fungus. The floor was uneven, littered with debris, and covered in a thick layer of dust. The air was cold and damp, carrying a faint, unpleasant odor of rot and decay. In one corner of the basement, an old furnace stood silent and foreboding. Its once bright metal surface was now tarnished and covered in a layer of grime. The furnace emitted a low, intermittent hum, a sound that seemed to resonate through the stillness of the basement. The shadows cast by the furnace danced erratically on the walls, creating an unsettling play of light and darkness. Nearby, a collection of old, forgotten items lay scattered and forgotten. An old wooden chest, its surface worn and scratched, was partially open, revealing a glimpse of its contents. The chest was filled with yellowed papers, old photographs, and broken trinkets, each item a relic of a time long past. The contents of the chest were coated in dust, their once bright colors now muted and faded. The basement's old workbench was cluttered with rusted tools and broken machinery. The tools, once neatly arranged, were now scattered and disorganized, their surfaces covered in a thick layer of dust. The workbench itself was darkened and worn, its once sturdy legs now wobbly and unstable. The area around the workbench was littered with scraps of metal and wood, adding to the sense of decay and neglect. The basement's oppressive atmosphere was further compounded by the presence of a large, metal door at the far end of the room. The door, heavy and rusted, was partially ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. The door's surface was covered in dark stains and scratches, evidence of long-forgotten attempts to force it open. The darkness beyond the door seemed to beckon, an unsettling invitation to explore the unknown. As one approached the door, the air grew colder, the chill intensifying with each step. The shadows around the door seemed to grow darker and more menacing, their forms shifting and contorting in the dim light. The metal door creaked ominously as it was pushed open, revealing a narrow passageway shrouded in darkness. The passageway beyond the door was narrow and constricted, the walls lined with old, crumbling brick. The air was damp and musty, carrying an unpleasant odor of decay. The temperature dropped noticeably as one ventured further into the passage, the chill seeping into the bones and creating an uncomfortable sense of foreboding. The passageway seemed to stretch on endlessly, its dimly lit interior filled with the sounds of dripping water and the occasional scurrying of unseen creatures. The shadows in the passageway grew darker and more pronounced, their forms twisting and shifting in the flickering light. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread, the oppressive atmosphere growing heavier with each step. At the end of the passageway, a large, heavy door stood closed, its surface covered in dark stains and scratches. The door seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy, its presence a dark invitation to the unknown. The temperature around the door was colder, the chill becoming almost unbearable as one approached. The door creaked open with a heavy groan, revealing a dark, cavernous space beyond. The room was vast and empty, its dimensions obscured by the inky darkness that filled the air. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, the air stagnant and heavy. The shadows in the room seemed to move with a life of their own, their forms shifting and coalescing into grotesque shapes. In the center of the room stood an old, dilapidated altar, its surface covered in dark stains and cobwebs. The altar was surrounded by a circle of dark, twisted symbols etched into the floor. The symbols were worn and faded, their meanings obscured by years of neglect and decay. The air around the altar was cold and oppressive, the sense of malevolence palpable. The room's oppressive atmosphere seemed to radiate outward, its darkness seeping into every corner. The shadows around the altar grew darker and more pronounced, their movements creating an unsettling rhythm that reverberated through the space. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, the chill creating an almost unbearable sense of dread. As one stood in the center of the room, the sense of being watched grew overwhelming. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, the shadows moving with an almost predatory intent. The oppressive silence was punctuated only by the occasional drip of water and the distant, eerie sound of the house settling. The presence in the house had grown stronger, its influence spreading to every corner of the basement. The altar, with its dark symbols and oppressive energy, was a focal point of the malevolent force that had taken hold. The darkness in the room seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, its presence a constant reminder of the evil that lurked within the house. As the night wore on, the sense of dread and foreboding continued to build. The oppressive atmosphere of the basement grew heavier, the darkness becoming almost tangible. The shadows around the altar seemed to grow more animated, their forms shifting and contorting in grotesque patterns. The temperature in the room dropped further, the chill becoming almost unbearable. The house had become a realm of unutterable darkness, its once familiar spaces now twisted and corrupted by the malevolent presence that had taken hold. The oppressive atmosphere of the basement was a stark reminder of the evil that lurked within the house, its shadows and distortions creating an ever-deepening sense of dread. The relentless descent into the darkness seemed to have no end, each step further into the abyss only revealing more of the malevolent force that had taken hold. The shadows and distortions in the basement were a manifestation of the evil that pervaded the house, their presence a constant reminder of the darkness that had claimed the once familiar space. In the depths of the house, the darkness was all-encompassing, its malevolent energy creating an oppressive atmosphere that was almost impossible to endure. The descent into the abyss had become a journey into the heart of darkness itself, a place where the shadows reigned supreme and the malevolent forces of evil lay in wait. Chapter 14. The Haunting Echoes. The house seemed to have entered a period of oppressive stillness, a heavy silence hanging over every room as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The atmosphere was thick with a palpable sense of dread, each creak of the floorboards or rustle of fabric echoing like a mournful cry through the oppressive quiet. In the parlor, the grand piano, which had long since fallen silent, seemed to be the focal point of the uneasy atmosphere. The once polished surface was now covered in a thick layer of dust, the keys yellowed and brittle with age. The shadows in the room moved with an eerie fluidity, cast by the dim, flickering light of the single lamp on the far side of the room. The lamp's light was weak, barely penetrating the encroaching darkness that seemed to have taken root in every corner. The piano bench, once a place of rest and music, now sat forlorn and abandoned. Its upholstery was faded and torn, the stuffing poking out in disheveled clumps. The echoes of past music seemed to linger in the air, a haunting reminder of the joy that once filled the space. Now, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional, mournful creak of the piano's wood as it settled. The walls of the parlor, lined with old portraits, seemed to close in on the space. The portraits, framed in ornate, tarnished gold, depicted long-dead ancestors with solemn, haunting expressions. The eyes of the portraits seemed to follow every movement, their gazes heavy with an unspoken sadness. The portraits were shrouded in shadows, their details obscured by the encroaching darkness. As night deepened, the parlor's atmosphere grew more oppressive. The shadows lengthened, their shapes merging and twisting into grotesque forms. The flickering light from the lamp cast erratic patterns on the walls, creating an unsettling dance of light and shadow. The once familiar space had become a realm of twisted shapes and unsettling echoes, each corner harboring its own dark secret. The sound of footsteps, though faint and barely perceptible, seemed to echo through the parlor. The footsteps were irregular, their rhythm erratic and unsettling. The echoes reverberated off the walls, creating a sense of disorientation and unease. The source of the footsteps remained hidden, the sound growing fainter and then more pronounced, as though taunting the listener with its presence. In the hallway leading to the study, the atmosphere was equally foreboding. The walls were lined with dark, heavy curtains that had long since gathered dust. The curtains hung limply, their once rich fabric now faded and tattered. The hallway was dimly lit by a single, flickering overhead light, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. The study, once a place of quiet contemplation, had become a repository of forgotten relics. The large oak desk, covered in piles of yellowed papers and old, dusty books, stood at the center of the room. The papers were scattered haphazardly, their contents obscured by the passage of time. The books, some open and others closed, were covered in a thick layer of dust, their pages yellowed and brittle. The study's walls were lined with dark wooden paneling, the surface marred by deep scratches and stains. The room was filled with a musty odor, a combination of old paper and damp wood. The air was heavy and oppressive, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of paper or the creak of the wooden floorboards. The large, ornate clock on the wall ticked steadily, its rhythmic sound a constant reminder of the passage of time. The clock's face was covered in a layer of dust, its hands moving with a slow, deliberate motion. The sound of the ticking was amplified in the silence, each second stretching out into eternity. In the corner of the study stood a tall, dark bookcase, its shelves filled with old, forgotten volumes. The books were arranged haphazardly, their spines faded and worn. The bookcase was covered in a thick layer of dust, the air around it growing colder and more oppressive. The shadows in the bookcase seemed to move with a life of their own, creating an unsettling play of light and darkness. The air in the study grew colder as the night wore on. The temperature dropped noticeably, the chills seeping into the bones and creating an almost unbearable sense of dread. The shadows on the walls seemed to grow darker and more pronounced, their forms twisting and contorting in grotesque patterns. In the far corner of the study, a large, heavy cabinet stood closed. The cabinet's surface was covered in dark stains and scratches, its doors slightly ajar. The interior of the cabinet was shrouded in darkness, the contents obscured by the lack of light. The air around the cabinet was colder, the chill creating an uncomfortable sensation as one approached. As the night deepened, the echoes in the house seemed to grow louder and more pronounced. The sounds of footsteps, whispers, and distant cries filled the air, creating a haunting symphony of despair. The once familiar spaces had become a labyrinth of shadows and echoes, each room a reflection of the malevolent presence that had taken hold. The oppressive atmosphere of the house seemed to weigh heavily on every room, the sense of foreboding growing with each passing moment. The echoes of the past, the lingering sense of sadness and despair, had become a constant reminder of the evil that lurked within. The shadows and distortions in the house were a manifestation of the malevolent force that had taken hold, their presence a chilling reminder of the darkness that had claimed the once familiar space. In the parlor, the echoes of past music seemed to blend with the eerie, mournful silence. The shadows on the walls seemed to move with an almost predatory intent, their forms shifting and contorting in unsettling patterns. The flickering light from the lamp cast erratic shadows, creating an unsettling play of light and darkness. The hallway leading to the study was filled with a palpable sense of dread. The heavy curtains, once a rich fabric, now hung limply, their presence a constant reminder of the passage of time. The shadows in the hallway seemed to merge and twist, their forms creating an eerie dance of light and darkness. In the study, the oppressive atmosphere was compounded by the presence of the old clock and the dusty bookcase. The rhythmic ticking of the clock was a constant reminder of the passage of time, each second stretching out into eternity. The shadows in the bookcase seemed to move with a life of their own, creating an unsettling effect. The house had become a realm of haunting echoes and oppressive darkness. The once familiar spaces had been twisted and corrupted by the malevolent presence that had taken hold. The shadows and distortions in every room were a manifestation of the evil that lurked within, their presence creating an ever-deepening sense of dread. As the night wore on, the oppressive silence of the house grew heavier. The echoes of the past, the lingering sense of despair, seemed to envelop every room. The darkness was all-encompassing, its malevolent energy creating an oppressive atmosphere that was almost unbearable. The house had become a labyrinth of shadows and echoes, a reflection of the darkness that had claimed its once familiar spaces. Chapter 15. The Corrupted Sanctuary. The house, once a symbol of refuge and safety, had deteriorated into a sanctuary of corruption and malevolence. Each room, each hallway, seemed to have absorbed the darkness that pervaded the air, transforming into a grotesque parody of its former self. The oppressive atmosphere had become a tangible force, pressing down on every surface, distorting every shadow. In the library, the shelves, once meticulously arranged, were now chaotic. Books lay scattered on the floor, their spines cracked and pages yellowed with age. The leather-bound volumes, which had once exuded an air of knowledge and wisdom, were now coated in a thick layer of dust, their surfaces marred by dark stains. The scent of old paper and dampness filled the air, a stark contrast to the vibrant, intellectual environment that had once been. The large, ornate fireplace in the library was cold and empty, its hearth blackened by years of neglect. The mantel above was lined with old, dusty trinkets and photographs, their surfaces coated in grime. The shadows cast by the flickering light of a single lamp seemed to dance across the walls, creating an eerie play of light and darkness that distorted the familiar space. The portraits that lined the library walls, once a testament to the family's history, had become a source of unease. The faces in the portraits seemed to have taken on a sinister quality, their eyes following every movement with a haunting, accusatory stare. The shadows in the portraits grew darker, their expressions more menacing, as though the very essence of the subjects had been twisted by the house's malevolent presence. The grand staircase, which had once been a focal point of elegance, had become a corridor of foreboding. The rich wooden banister was now darkened with grime, its once polished surface marred by deep scratches. The walls of the staircase were lined with old, faded wallpaper, their intricate patterns now barely discernible through layers of dust and decay. The dim, flickering light from a single overhead bulb cast long, erratic shadows that seemed to crawl up and down the staircase with an unsettling life of their own. The bedrooms on the upper floors had become sanctuaries of desolation. The once comfortable beds were now shrouded in moth-eaten linens and stained with dark, unknown substances. The furniture, once carefully arranged, was now scattered and disheveled. The shadows in the rooms seemed to stretch and elongate, merging into grotesque forms that distorted the familiar space. In one of the bedrooms, an old, antique rocking chair stood abandoned in a corner. The chair, once a symbol of comfort, was now covered in a thick layer of dust and grime. The gentle creak of the chair, when moved by an unseen force, added an eerie, haunting quality to the room. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, the oppressive atmosphere growing heavier with each passing moment. The hallway connecting the bedrooms was filled with a sense of disorientation. The walls seemed to close in, their surfaces covered in dark stains and cobwebs. The flickering light from the overhead bulb cast erratic shadows that danced along the walls, creating a sense of unease and confusion. The once familiar layout of the hallway had become a labyrinth of shifting shadows and distorted shapes. In the master bedroom, the large, ornate bed was the focal point of a nightmarish transformation. The canopy above the bed had been torn and shredded, the fabric hanging in tatters. The once luxurious bedspread was now stained and soiled, its bright colors dulled by grime. The shadows in the room seemed to converge on the bed, their forms twisting and distorting into grotesque shapes that added to the sense of dread. The air in the master bedroom was colder, the chill seeping into the bones. The oppressive atmosphere was thick with an almost tangible sense of malevolence. The shadows on the walls moved with an unnatural fluidity, their forms merging and shifting into nightmarish patterns. The temperature seemed to drop further as the night wore on, the cold becoming almost unbearable. The attic, once a place of forgotten memories and stored belongings, had become a repository of dark energy. The space was cluttered with old trunks, dusty furniture, and cobweb-covered relics. The dim light from a single, bare bulb cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and crawl across the walls. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay, the oppressive atmosphere adding to the sense of dread. In one corner of the attic stood a large, old trunk, its surface covered in dark stains and scratches. The trunk was partially open, revealing a glimpse of its contents. Inside, old clothing, yellowed documents, and broken trinkets lay scattered, their once vibrant colors now faded and dull. The trunk seemed to emanate a sense of foreboding, its presence a dark reminder of the past. The basement, already a place of oppressive darkness, had taken on an even more sinister quality. The walls were covered in creeping black mold, their surfaces darkened and decayed. The air was cold and damp, carrying a faint, unpleasant odor of rot. The shadows in the basement seemed to writhe and twist, their forms merging into grotesque shapes that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The large metal door in the basement had become a focal point of dread. The door, rusted and battered, was slightly ajar, its creaking hinges echoing through the oppressive silence. Beyond the door, a narrow staircase led down into an even deeper, darker space. The temperature around the door was colder, the chill becoming almost unbearable as one approached. Descending the staircase revealed a hidden chamber, its walls covered in ancient symbols and dark, twisted drawings. The chamber was filled with a palpable sense of malevolence, its air thick with an oppressive energy that seemed to press down on every surface. The symbols on the walls were faded and worn, their meanings obscured by the passage of time. The darkness in the chamber seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the shadows moving in eerie patterns that defied explanation. In the center of the chamber stood a large, dark altar, its surface covered in dark stains and cobwebs. The altar was surrounded by a circle of twisted, dark symbols etched into the floor. The symbols seemed to writhe and shift, their forms merging and blending into an unsettling mosaic. The air around the altar was cold and oppressive, the sense of malevolence almost overwhelming. The shadows in the chamber seemed to move with a malevolent intent, their forms twisting and contorting in grotesque patterns. The temperature in the room dropped further, the chill becoming almost unbearable. The oppressive atmosphere was thick with a sense of foreboding, the darkness closing in on every side. As the night wore on, the sense of dread and unease continued to build. The once familiar spaces of the house had been transformed into a realm of corruption and malevolence. The shadows and distortions in every room were a manifestation of the evil that had taken hold, their presence a constant reminder of the darkness that had claimed the house. The oppressive atmosphere of the house seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. The echoes of the past, the lingering sense of despair and dread, had become an inescapable part of the house's reality. The once comfortable sanctuary had become a twisted, nightmarish realm, its darkness a reflection of the malevolent force that had taken root within its walls. Chapter 16. The Echoes of Despair. The night had deepened, and the house lay in a shroud of impenetrable darkness. Each room, once a sanctuary, had become a testament to the malevolence that had taken hold, the air thick with an oppressive sense of despair. The corridors and rooms seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the shadows shifting and distorting in grotesque patterns. In the dining room, the large oak table, once the centerpiece of family gatherings, was now a symbol of desolation. The table was covered in a thick layer of dust and grime, its surface marred by dark stains and scratches. The once polished silverware lay tarnished and scattered across the table, the once lustrous surface now dulled by years of neglect. The chairs around the table were overturned and broken, their upholstery worn and tattered. The chandelier above the table hung askew, its crystals covered in layers of dust. The light from the chandelier had long since gone out, leaving the room in near-total darkness. The shadows cast by the chandelier's remnants created eerie, flickering patterns on the walls, adding to the unsettling atmosphere of the room. The walls of the dining room were covered in faded wallpaper, the intricate patterns barely discernible through the grime and decay. The wallpaper was peeling away in large strips, exposing the dark, stained wood beneath. The once bright colors had faded to a dull, lifeless hue, the room now a grim reminder of the past. In the kitchen, the once bustling space was now a scene of abandonment and neglect. The countertops, once neatly arranged with cooking utensils and ingredients, were now cluttered with broken dishes, rotting food, and thick layers of grime. The old stove, once a source of warmth and nourishment, stood cold and silent, its surface covered in a layer of grease and dust. The refrigerator door was slightly ajar, its contents long since spoiled and decomposed. The once cold interior was now a haven for mold and decay, the smell of rot permeating the air. The shadows in the kitchen seemed to move with an unnatural fluidity, the darkness creeping into every corner. The pantry, once a place of abundance, had become a repository of decay. The shelves were lined with empty, dusty jars and cans, their contents long since spoiled. The floor was covered in a thick layer of debris, the remnants of forgotten meals scattered and forgotten. The air in the pantry was cold and musty, carrying the faint, unpleasant odor of rot and mildew. The living room, once a place of comfort and relaxation, had become a realm of despair. The furniture, once arranged for comfort and ease, was now scattered and broken. The plush sofas and armchairs were covered in torn upholstery and dark stains, their cushions flattened and worn. The coffee table in the center of the room was overturned, its surface marred by deep scratches and dark stains. The fireplace, once a source of warmth and light, was now cold and empty. The hearth was blackened with soot, the remnants of old fires long since extinguished. The mantel above was cluttered with broken trinkets and dusty photographs, their surfaces coated in grime. The shadows cast by the flickering light of a single lamp seemed to dance across the walls, creating an unsettling play of light and darkness. The hallways of the house seemed to stretch endlessly, their once familiar layout now distorted and confusing. The walls were covered in dark stains and cobwebs, the surfaces marred by deep scratches and gouges. The flickering light from the overhead bulbs cast erratic shadows that seemed to crawl along the walls, creating an eerie, disorienting effect. In the nursery, the atmosphere was one of profound sadness. The crib, once a symbol of innocence and care, was now empty and abandoned. The soft, pastel colors of the nursery were faded and dull, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper and dark stains. The toys that had once filled the room with joy were now scattered and broken, their once bright colors now muted and faded. The rocking chair in the corner, once a place of comfort and warmth, was now covered in dust and grime. The chair's gentle creak, when moved by an unseen force, added to the eerie, haunting atmosphere of the room. The air in the nursery was heavy with an oppressive sense of despair, the atmosphere thick with a sense of loss and abandonment. The bathrooms of the house, once places of cleanliness and order, had become grim reminders of decay. The sinks and bathtubs were filled with dark, stagnant water, the surfaces covered in mold and grime. The mirrors were cracked and coated in a thick layer of dust, their once reflective surfaces now obscured by layers of decay. The once bright tiles were now darkened and stained, the grout between them covered in mold and grime. The air in the bathrooms was cold and damp, carrying the faint, unpleasant odor of decay. The shadows in the bathrooms seemed to move with an unnatural fluidity, the darkness creeping into every corner. In the attic, the sense of abandonment was even more pronounced. The space was cluttered with old, forgotten belongings, their surfaces coated in a thick layer of dust and grime. The wooden beams that supported the ceiling were darkened with moisture and decay, their surfaces covered in creeping black mold. The shadows cast by the dim light of a single bulb seemed to crawl along the walls, creating an unsettling play of light and darkness. The large, old trunk in the attic had become a focal point of dread. The trunk, covered in dark stains and scratches, was partially open, revealing a glimpse of its contents. Inside, old clothing, yellowed documents, and broken trinkets lay scattered, their once vibrant colors now faded and dull. The trunk seemed to emanate a sense of foreboding, its presence a dark reminder of the past. The basement, already a place of dark, oppressive energy, had taken on an even more sinister quality. The walls were covered in dark, creeping mold, their surfaces marred by deep gouges and stains. The air was colder and more oppressive, carrying the faint, unpleasant odor of rot and decay. The shadows in the basement seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, their forms merging and twisting into grotesque shapes. The large, heavy door in the basement, once a barrier to the unknown, now stood open, its creaking hinges echoing through the oppressive silence. Beyond the door, a narrow staircase led further down into an even darker, more foreboding space. The temperature around the door was colder, the chill seeping into the bones and creating an uncomfortable sense of dread. Descending the staircase revealed a hidden chamber, its walls covered in ancient symbols and dark, twisted drawings. The chamber was filled with a palpable sense of malevolence, the air thick with an oppressive energy that seemed to press down on every surface. The symbols on the walls were faded and worn, their meanings obscured by the passage of time. The darkness in the chamber seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the shadows moving in eerie patterns that defied explanation. In the center of the chamber stood a large, dark altar, its surface covered in dark stains and cobwebs. The altar was surrounded by a circle of twisted, dark symbols etched into the floor. The symbols seemed to writhe and shift, their forms merging and blending into an unsettling mosaic. The air around the altar was cold and oppressive, the sense of malevolence almost overwhelming. The shadows in the chamber seemed to move with a malevolent intent, their forms twisting and contorting in grotesque patterns. The temperature in the room dropped further, the chill becoming almost unbearable. The oppressive atmosphere was thick with a sense of foreboding, the darkness closing in on every side. As the night wore on, The house seemed to be consumed by a relentless darkness. The oppressive atmosphere of each room and corridor grew heavier, the sense of despair and dread becoming almost tangible. The once familiar spaces had been twisted and corrupted by the malevolent presence that had taken hold, their shadows and distortions a manifestation of the evil that lurked within. The echoes of despair and abandonment filled every corner of the house, creating a haunting symphony of sorrow and dread. The darkness was all-encompassing, its malevolent energy creating an oppressive atmosphere that was almost impossible to endure. The house had become a labyrinth of shadows and echoes, a reflection of the darkness that had claimed its once familiar spaces. Chapter 17. The Forsaken Chamber. The house had plunged into a deeper abyss of darkness, its oppressive atmosphere permeating every room and hallway. The once vibrant spaces had become dark, twisted versions of their former selves, each room echoing with the weight of despair and malevolence. The sense of foreboding was almost palpable, each corner of the house a testament to the malevolent force that had taken hold. In the drawing room, the heavy curtains had been drawn tight, blocking out any remaining light. The room was shrouded in an almost impenetrable darkness, the once rich fabric of the curtains now moth-eaten and tattered. The grand fireplace, once a focal point of warmth and light, was cold and empty, its hearth filled with dark ashes and soot. The shadows cast by the flickering light of a single lamp created eerie, shifting patterns on the walls, distorting the familiar space. The furniture in the drawing room was covered in a thick layer of dust and grime. The elegant chairs and sofas were now worn and torn, their upholstery faded and stained. The coffee table in the center of the room was cluttered with broken trinkets and dust-covered photographs. The once ornate rug on the floor was now covered in dark stains and dirt, its intricate patterns barely discernible. The walls of the drawing room were adorned with old, faded wallpaper, the intricate designs obscured by layers of grime and decay. The wallpaper was peeling away in large strips, revealing the dark, stained wood beneath. The once bright colors had faded to a dull, lifeless hue, the room now a grim reminder of the past. The hallway leading to the drawing room was dimly lit by a single overhead light, its bulb flickering erratically. The walls were covered in dark stains and cobwebs, the surfaces marred by deep scratches and gouges. The shadows cast by the flickering light created an unsettling play of light and darkness, the familiar layout of the hallway now distorted and disorienting. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, the atmosphere was heavy with an oppressive sense of dread. The once comfortable bed was now shrouded in moth-eaten linens, the fabric stained and torn. The furniture in the room was scattered and broken, the once neat arrangement now a chaotic mess. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper and dark stains, the air thick with dust and decay. The shadows in the bedroom seemed to move with an unnatural fluidity, their forms twisting and distorting into grotesque shapes. The temperature in the room was colder, the chills seeping into the bones and creating an almost unbearable sense of dread. The once familiar space had become a realm of darkness and despair, each corner a reflection of the malevolent force that had taken hold. The attic, already a place of abandonment and decay, had taken on an even more sinister quality. The space was cluttered with old, forgotten belongings, their surfaces coated in a thick layer of dust and grime. The wooden beams that supported the ceiling were darkened with moisture and decay, their surfaces covered in creeping black mold. The shadows cast by the dim light of a single bulb seemed to crawl along the walls, creating an unsettling play of light and darkness. The large, old trunk in the attic was partially open, its contents a jumble of old clothing, yellowed documents, and broken trinkets. The trunk seemed to emanate a sense of foreboding, its presence a dark reminder of the past. The air in the attic was cold and musty, carrying the faint, unpleasant odor of decay. The basement, already a place of dark, oppressive energy, had become even more sinister. The walls were covered in dark, creeping mold, their surfaces marred by deep gouges and stains. The air was colder and more oppressive, carrying the faint, unpleasant odor of rot and decay. The shadows in the basement seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, their forms merging and twisting into grotesque shapes. The large, heavy door in the basement stood open, its creaking hinges echoing through the oppressive silence. Beyond the door, a narrow staircase led further down into an even darker, more foreboding space. The temperature around the door was colder, the chill seeping into the bones and creating an uncomfortable sense of dread. Descending the staircase revealed a hidden chamber, its walls covered in ancient symbols and dark, twisted drawings. The chamber was filled with a palpable sense of malevolence, the air thick with an oppressive energy that seemed to press down on every surface. The symbols on the walls were faded and worn, their meanings obscured by the passage of time. The darkness in the chamber seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the shadows moving in eerie patterns that defied explanation. In the center of the chamber stood a large, dark altar, its surface covered in dark stains and cobwebs. The altar was surrounded by a circle of twisted, dark symbols etched into the floor. The symbols seemed to writhe and shift, their forms merging and blending into an unsettling mosaic. The air around the altar was cold and oppressive, the sense of malevolence almost overwhelming. The shadows in the chamber seemed to move with a malevolent intent, their forms twisting and contorting in grotesque patterns. The temperature in the room dropped further, the chill becoming almost unbearable. The oppressive atmosphere was thick with a sense of foreboding, the darkness closing in on every side. The nursery, once a place of innocence and care, had become a realm of profound sadness. The crib was empty and abandoned, the soft, pastel colors of the nursery faded and dull. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper and dark stains. The toys that had once filled the room with joy scattered and broken. The rocking chair in the corner was covered in dust and grime, its gentle creak adding to the eerie, haunting atmosphere of the room. The air in the nursery was heavy with an oppressive sense of despair, the atmosphere thick with a sense of loss and abandonment. The once bright tiles in the bathrooms were darkened and stained, the grout between them covered in mold and grime. The sinks and bathtubs were filled with dark, stagnant water, the surfaces covered in mold and decay. The mirrors were cracked and coated in a thick layer of dust, their once reflective surfaces now obscured by layers of grime. In the living room, the furniture was scattered and broken, the plush sofas and armchairs covered in torn upholstery and dark stains. The coffee table in the center of the room was overturned, its surface marred by deep scratches and dark stains. The fireplace, once a source of warmth and light, was cold and empty, its hearth blackened with soot. The house had become a labyrinth of shadows and echoes, each room and corridor a reflection of the malevolent force that had claimed it. The oppressive atmosphere was almost unbearable, the darkness closing in on every side. The echoes of despair and abandonment filled every corner, creating a haunting symphony of sorrow and dread. The darkness was all-encompassing, its malevolent energy creating an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press down on every surface. The once familiar spaces had been twisted and corrupted, their shadows and distortions a manifestation of the evil that lurked within. The house was a forsaken chamber of darkness and despair, its reality a grim reflection of the malevolent force that had taken hold. Chapter 18. The Unseen Terrors. The house's malevolent presence seemed to permeate even the faintest of sounds. The oppressive silence was occasionally broken by the creaks and groans of the old structure, each noise echoing like a distant whisper of some unseen terror. The once familiar spaces now seemed alien and foreboding, the shadows twisting into shapes that defied reality. The foyer, once a place of welcoming and warmth, had become a dark and unsettling entryway. The grand staircase, now coated in dust and grime, led upward into a labyrinth of shadow. The once polished banisters were now tarnished, their surfaces marred by deep scratches and dark stains. The portraits that lined the walls had faded into obscurity, their once clear images now ghostly and indistinct. The floor tiles, once bright and welcoming, were now cracked and dirty. The large, ornate rug that had once graced the entryway was now covered in dark stains and debris, its once vibrant colors muted by years of neglect. The flickering light from a single, dim chandelier cast erratic shadows that danced along the walls, creating an unsettling play of light and darkness. As one ventured deeper into the house, the oppressive atmosphere grew heavier. The grand hall, which had once been a space for gatherings and celebrations, was now a corridor of decay and darkness. The ceiling was covered in dark stains, and the once grand chandelier that hung from above was now a twisted mass of broken crystals and tarnished metal. The shadows cast by the broken chandelier seemed to writhe and twist, creating an eerie and unsettling effect. The air in the grand hall was thick with dust and mildew, the scent of decay lingering in every breath. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, the intricate patterns barely discernible through layers of grime and neglect. The once gleaming wooden paneling was now darkened and worn, its surfaces marred by deep scratches and gouges. In the library, the atmosphere was one of profound abandonment. The shelves, once filled with books and knowledge, were now bare and empty, the books long since fallen victim to decay and neglect. The wooden bookshelves were coated in a thick layer of dust, their once rich finish now dull and cracked. The large desk in the center of the room was covered in broken ink bottles and yellowed papers, the once clear surface now obscured by layers of grime. The fireplace in the library was cold and empty, its hearth filled with dark, sooty ashes. The large, leather armchair that once occupied a place of prominence was now tattered and worn, its upholstery cracked and stained. The shadows in the library seemed to move with an unnatural fluidity, the darkness creeping into every corner and creating an unsettling atmosphere. The staircases that connected the different levels of the house were now steeped in darkness, their once familiar steps covered in thick layers of dust. The banisters were covered in cobwebs, their surfaces tarnished and worn. The flickering light from the dim bulbs created a sense of disorientation, the shadows twisting and merging into grotesque shapes that seemed to defy explanation. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, the sense of despair was almost palpable. The bed, once a place of comfort, was now a neglected, dust-covered relic. The sheets were tattered and stained, the mattress sagging and worn. The furniture in the room was scattered and broken, the once neat arrangement now a chaotic mess of debris and decay. The walls of the bedroom were covered in peeling wallpaper, the patterns obscured by layers of grime and neglect. The windows were coated in a thick layer of dust, their once clear panes now dark and opaque. The air in the room was heavy with the scent of mildew, the oppressive atmosphere creating a sense of profound discomfort. In the nursery, the sense of loss and abandonment was almost overwhelming. The crib, once a symbol of care and innocence, was now empty and forlorn. The pastel colors of the nursery were faded and dull, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper and dark stains. The toys that had once filled the room with joy were now scattered and broken, their once bright colors muted by years of neglect. The rocking chair in the corner of the nursery was covered in dust and grime, its gentle creak adding to the eerie, haunting atmosphere of the room. The air was thick with a sense of abandonment, the oppressive atmosphere almost unbearable. The bathrooms of the house had become grim reminders of decay and neglect. The sinks and bathtubs were filled with dark, stagnant water, the surfaces covered in mold and grime. The mirrors were cracked and coated in a thick layer of dust, their once reflective surfaces now obscured. The tiles were darkened and stained, the grout between them covered in layers of mold. In the basement, the sense of malevolence was almost overwhelming. The walls were covered in creeping black mold, their surfaces marred by deep gouges and stains. The temperature was cold and oppressive, the air heavy with the scent of rot and decay. The shadows in the basement seemed to pulse with a dark energy, their forms twisting and merging into grotesque shapes. The large, heavy door in the basement led to an even darker, more foreboding space. The narrow staircase descended into a hidden chamber, its walls covered in ancient symbols and dark, twisted drawings. The chamber was filled with a palpable sense of malevolence, the air thick with an oppressive energy that seemed to press down on every surface. The symbols on the walls were faded and worn, their meanings obscured by the passage of time. The darkness in the chamber seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the shadows moving in eerie patterns that defied explanation. The large, dark altar in the center of the chamber was covered in dark stains and cobwebs, surrounded by a circle of twisted, dark symbols etched into the floor. The shadows in the chamber seemed to move with a malevolent intent, their forms twisting and contorting into grotesque patterns. The temperature in the room dropped further, the chill becoming almost unbearable. The oppressive atmosphere was thick with a sense of foreboding, the darkness closing in on every side. The house had become a realm of shadows and echoes, each room and corridor a reflection of the malevolent force that had taken hold. The once familiar spaces were now twisted and corrupted, their darkness and despair a manifestation of the evil that lurked within. The echoes of terror and abandonment filled every corner, creating a haunting symphony of dread and despair. The house was a labyrinth of unseen horrors, its reality a grim testament to the malevolent presence that had claimed it. Chapter 19. The Haunting Revelations. The house had grown quieter, as if holding its breath in anticipation of the dark events that were about to unfold. The oppressive atmosphere that had settled over every corner seemed to have thickened, turning the already desolate spaces into even more sinister realms. The shadows, now deep and unfathomable, seemed to pulse with a malignant energy, their forms shifting in grotesque patterns that defied reason. In the grand hallway, the once magnificent staircase had become a sinister structure of shadows and decay. The steps, covered in a thick layer of dust, creaked under the weight of a long-forgotten sorrow. The dark, tarnished banisters were coated in cobwebs, their surfaces marred by deep scratches and dark stains. The flickering light from the overhead chandelier cast erratic shadows that seemed to writhe and twist, creating an unsettling play of light and darkness on the walls. The walls of the grand hallway were covered in faded wallpaper, its intricate patterns barely visible through layers of grime and neglect. The once bright colors had faded to a dull, lifeless hue, the room now a grim reminder of the malevolent presence that had taken hold. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and decay, the oppressive atmosphere almost palpable. In the library, the sense of abandonment was profound. The shelves, once filled with books and knowledge, were now bare and empty. The wooden bookshelves were coated in a thick layer of dust, their once rich finish now dull and cracked. The large desk in the center of the room was covered in broken ink bottles and yellowed papers, the surface obscured by layers of grime. The fireplace was cold and empty, its hearth filled with dark, sooty ashes. The shadows in the library seemed to move with an unnatural fluidity, their forms twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes. The temperature in the room was colder, the chill seeping into the bones and creating an almost unbearable sense of dread. The oppressive atmosphere was thick with a sense of loss and despair, the once familiar space now a realm of darkness and decay. The bedrooms, once places of comfort and rest, had become chambers of despair. The beds were covered in moth-eaten linens, the fabric stained and torn. The furniture was scattered and broken, the once neat arrangement now a chaotic mess of debris and decay. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper and dark stains, the air thick with dust and mildew. In the nursery, the sense of loss and abandonment was almost overwhelming. The crib, once a symbol of care and innocence, was now empty and forlorn. The pastel colors of the nursery were faded and dull, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper and dark stains. The toys that had once filled the room with joy were now scattered and broken, their once bright colors muted by years of neglect. The rocking chair in the corner was covered in dust and grime, its gentle creak adding to the eerie, haunting atmosphere of the room. The air was heavy with a sense of abandonment, the oppressive atmosphere almost unbearable. The shadows in the nursery seemed to move with a malevolent intent, their forms twisting and contorting into grotesque patterns. In the basement, the sense of malevolence was almost palpable. The walls were covered in creeping black mold, their surfaces marred by deep gouges and stains. The temperature was cold and oppressive, the air heavy with the scent of rot and decay. The shadows in the basement seemed to pulse with a dark energy, their forms merging and twisting into grotesque shapes. The large, heavy door in the basement led to an even darker, more foreboding space. The narrow staircase descended into a hidden chamber, its walls covered in ancient symbols and dark, twisted drawings. The chamber was filled with a palpable sense of malevolence, the air thick with an oppressive energy that seemed to press down on every surface. The symbols on the walls were faded and worn, their meanings obscured by the passage of time. The large, dark altar in the center of the chamber was covered in dark stains and cobwebs. The altar was surrounded by a circle of twisted, dark symbols etched into the floor. The symbols seemed to writhe and shift, their forms merging and blending into an unsettling mosaic. The air around the altar was cold and oppressive, the sense of malevolence almost overwhelming. The shadows in the chamber seemed to move with a malevolent intent, their forms twisting and contorting into grotesque patterns. The temperature in the room dropped further, the chill becoming almost unbearable. The oppressive atmosphere was thick with a sense of foreboding, the darkness closing in on every side. In the kitchen, the atmosphere was one of grim neglect. The countertops were cluttered with broken dishes, rotting food, and thick layers of grime. The old stove was cold and silent, its surface covered in grease and dust. The refrigerator door was slightly ajar, its contents long since spoiled and decomposed. The shadows in the kitchen seemed to move with an unnatural fluidity, the darkness creeping into every corner. The pantry, once a place of abundance, had become a repository of decay. The shelves were lined with empty, dusty jars and cans, their contents long since spoiled. The floor was covered in a thick layer of debris, the remnants of forgotten meals scattered and forgotten. The air in the pantry was cold and musty, carrying the faint, unpleasant odor of rot and mildew. The living room, once a place of comfort and relaxation, had become a realm of desolation. The furniture was scattered and broken, the plush sofas and armchairs covered in torn upholstery and dark stains. The coffee table in the center of the room was overturned, its surface marred by deep scratches and dark stains. The fireplace, once a source of warmth and light, was cold and empty, its hearth blackened with soot. In the attic, the atmosphere was one of profound abandonment. The space was cluttered with old, forgotten belongings, their surfaces coated in a thick layer of dust and grime. The wooden beams that supported the ceiling were darkened with moisture and decay, their surfaces covered in creeping black mold. The shadows cast by the dim light of a single bulb seemed to crawl along the walls, creating an unsettling play of light and darkness. The large, old trunk in the attic was partially open, its contents a jumble of old clothing, yellowed documents, and broken trinkets. The trunk seemed to emanate a sense of foreboding, its presence a dark reminder of the past. The air in the attic was cold and musty, carrying the faint, unpleasant odor of decay. Throughout the house, the oppressive atmosphere grew heavier, the sense of despair and malevolence almost palpable. The once familiar spaces had been twisted and corrupted by the dark presence that had taken hold. The shadows and distortions were manifestations of the evil that lurked within, each room and corridor a reflection of the malevolent force that had claimed the house. The house had become a labyrinth of darkness and dread, its reality a grim testament to the malevolent presence that had taken hold. The echoes of despair and abandonment filled every corner, creating a haunting symphony of sorrow and terror. The unseen horrors that lurked in every shadow were a reflection of the darkness that had consumed the once familiar spaces, their presence an ever-present reminder of the evil that had claimed the house. Chapter 20. The Awakening. The house, once a proud symbol of stability and comfort, had transformed into a realm of deep, unyielding darkness. Its once familiar spaces were now twisted into grotesque parodies of their former selves, each room and corridor suffused with a sense of foreboding and dread. The malevolent energy that had claimed the house seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, its influence reaching into every corner. In the grand hallway, the staircase seemed to lead downward into an abyss of shadows. The once polished steps were now covered in a thick layer of dust and grime, their surfaces marred by deep scratches and dark stains. The flickering light from the tarnished chandelier above cast erratic shadows that danced along the walls, creating an unsettling play of light and darkness. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and decay, each breath filled with the oppressive weight of the house's transformation. The library, once a sanctuary of knowledge and calm, had become a chamber of despair. The shelves, stripped of their books, stood as empty sentinels of neglect. The large desk in the center of the room was cluttered with broken ink bottles, yellowed papers, and dust-covered relics. The fireplace, cold and empty, held only dark, sooty ashes. The shadows in the library seemed to move with a sinister intent, their forms twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes that defied explanation. The oppressive atmosphere was almost suffocating, the air thick with a sense of loss and abandonment. Upstairs, the bedrooms were now spectral realms of desolation. The beds, covered in moth-eaten linens and stained fabric, were reminders of a time long past. The furniture, once arranged with care, was now scattered and broken, the once neat arrangement now a chaotic mess of debris and decay. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper and dark stains, the air heavy with dust and mildew. The sense of abandonment was almost palpable, the oppressive atmosphere creating an unbearable sense of dread. In the nursery, the once vibrant colors had faded to a dull, lifeless hue. The crib, empty and forlorn, stood as a stark reminder of what had been lost. The pastel wallpaper was peeling away, revealing dark stains beneath. The toys that had once brought joy were now scattered and broken, their colors muted by years of neglect. The rocking chair in the corner was covered in dust and grime, its creak adding to the eerie, haunting atmosphere. The air was thick with a sense of abandonment, the oppressive atmosphere almost unbearable. The kitchen had become a grim repository of decay. The countertops were cluttered with broken dishes, rotting food, and layers of grime. The old stove was cold and silent, its surface covered in grease and dust. The refrigerator door hung ajar, its contents spoiled and decomposed. The shadows in the kitchen seemed to move with an unnatural fluidity, the darkness creeping into every corner. The air was heavy with the unpleasant odor of rot and mildew. In the basement, the sense of malevolence was overwhelming. The walls were covered in creeping black mold, their surfaces marred by deep gouges and stains. The temperature was cold and oppressive, the air thick with the scent of decay. The shadows seemed to pulse with a dark energy, their forms merging and twisting into grotesque shapes. The large, heavy door leading to the basement was ajar, creaking softly as if beckoning the unwary to descend into the darkness below. The hidden chamber beneath the basement held an air of ancient malevolence. The walls were covered in faded symbols and dark, twisted drawings, their meanings obscured by time. The large, dark altar in the center of the chamber was covered in dark stains and cobwebs, its presence a dark reminder of the past. The circle of twisted, dark symbols etched into the floor seemed to writhe and shift, creating an unsettling mosaic. The air around the altar was cold and oppressive, the sense of malevolence almost overwhelming. The attic, cluttered with forgotten belongings, was a realm of abandonment. The space was filled with old clothing, yellowed documents, and broken trinkets, their surfaces coated in dust and grime. The wooden beams that supported the ceiling were darkened with moisture and decay, covered in creeping black mold. The shadows cast by the dim light of a single bulb seemed to crawl along the walls, creating an eerie play of light and darkness. The large, old trunk in the attic was partially open, its contents a jumble of forgotten relics. Throughout the house, the atmosphere grew more oppressive, the sense of despair and malevolence almost palpable. The once familiar spaces had been twisted and corrupted by the dark presence that had taken hold. The shadows and distortions were manifestations of the evil that lurked within, each room and corridor a reflection of the malevolent force that had claimed the house. As night fell, a profound stillness settled over the house. The darkness outside seemed to press in against the walls, merging with the deep shadows within. The oppressive silence was occasionally broken by the distant creaks and groans of the old structure, each noise echoing like a distant whisper of some unseen terror. The house, now a labyrinth of shadows and echoes, seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the dark events that were about to unfold. In the deepest recesses of the house, a dark energy seemed to coalesce, its presence almost tangible. The shadows in the hidden chamber beneath the basement grew more pronounced, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to defy reality. The cold, oppressive atmosphere was thick with a sense of foreboding, the darkness closing in on every side. The house had become a realm of unseen terrors, each room and corridor a reflection of the malevolent force that had claimed it. The echoes of despair and abandonment filled every corner, creating a haunting symphony of sorrow and dread. The darkness that had taken hold of the house seemed to grow stronger, its influence reaching into every shadow and crevice. The malevolent presence that had claimed the house seemed to awaken fully, its dark energy swirling and coalescing into an ever more oppressive force. The once familiar spaces had become realms of darkness and decay, each room a testament to the evil that had taken hold. The shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own, their movements creating an unsettling play of light and darkness. As the night deepened, the sense of dread grew almost unbearable. The darkness seemed to press in on every side, the oppressive atmosphere almost suffocating. The house, now a labyrinth of shadows and echoes, was a grim reminder of the malevolent force that had claimed it. The unseen terrors that lurked in every corner were a reflection of the darkness that had consumed the once familiar spaces, their presence a constant reminder of the evil that had taken hold. Chapter 21. The Descent. As dawn approached, the house remained cloaked in its perennial darkness. The sun's rays barely pierced the thick layer of grime that coated the windows, leaving the interior in a state of twilight gloom. The heavy air was thick with the scent of decay, the oppressive atmosphere a constant reminder of the malevolent force that had claimed the once familiar spaces. The grand hallway, now a corridor of shadows, seemed even more sinister in the pale light of dawn. The staircase, once a symbol of elegance and grandeur, had become a grim monument to neglect. The dust-covered steps were now a treacherous path, the dark stains and scratches on the banisters bearing witness to the passage of time and sorrow. The flickering light from the tarnished chandelier above cast long, twisted shadows along the walls, their forms shifting and merging into grotesque shapes. The library, with its once vibrant collection of books, was now a room of profound desolation. The empty shelves stood as silent sentinels of neglect, their surfaces coated in thick layers of dust. The large desk, once a place of scholarly pursuits, was now cluttered with broken ink bottles, yellowed papers, and the remnants of forgotten relics. The cold, empty fireplace held only dark, sooty ashes, the shadows around it writhing with an eerie fluidity. The oppressive atmosphere of the library was almost palpable, each breath laden with the weight of abandonment and despair. The bedrooms, each a relic of comfort turned to decay, echoed with a haunting silence. The beds, draped in moth-eaten linens, were now sagging and stained, their once soft fabrics a shadow of their former selves. The furniture, once meticulously arranged, was now scattered and broken, the once neat spaces now a chaotic mess of debris. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper and dark stains, the air heavy with the musty scent of mildew. The oppressive atmosphere in each room was a constant reminder of the house's transformation into a realm of despair. The nursery, a once innocent space of pastel colors and toys, had become a chamber of sorrow. The crib, now empty and forlorn, stood as a silent witness to the passage of time. The pastel wallpaper was peeling away, revealing dark stains beneath. The toys that had once filled the room with joy were now scattered and broken, their once bright colors muted by years of neglect. The rocking chair, covered in dust and grime, creaked softly, its gentle motion adding to the eerie, haunting atmosphere. The air in the nursery was thick with a sense of abandonment, the oppressive atmosphere almost unbearable. In the kitchen, the signs of neglect were evident in every corner. The countertops were cluttered with broken dishes, rotting food, and layers of grime. The old stove, cold and silent, was covered in grease and dust. The refrigerator door hung ajar, its contents long spoiled and decomposed. The shadows in the kitchen seemed to move with an unnatural fluidity, the darkness creeping into every corner. The air was heavy with the unpleasant odor of rot and mildew, the oppressive atmosphere creating a sense of profound discomfort. The basement, a place of dark energy and malevolence, seemed to exude an almost palpable sense of dread. The walls were covered in creeping black mold, their surfaces marred by deep gouges and stains. The temperature was cold and oppressive, the air thick with the scent of decay. The shadows seemed to pulse with a dark energy, their forms merging and twisting into grotesque shapes. The large, heavy door leading to the basement was ajar, creaking softly as if beckoning the unwary to descend into the darkness below. The attic, cluttered with forgotten belongings, was a space of abandonment and decay. The wooden beams that supported the ceiling were darkened with moisture and decay, covered in creeping black mold. The shadows cast by the dim light of a single bulb seemed to crawl along the walls, creating an eerie play of light and darkness. The large, old trunk in the attic was partially open, its contents a jumble of forgotten relics, old clothing, and yellowed documents. As the day wore on, the house seemed to become even more oppressive. The once familiar spaces had been twisted and corrupted by the dark presence that had taken hold. Each room and corridor was a reflection of the malevolent force that had claimed the house, the shadows and distortions manifesting as an ever-present reminder of the evil that lurked within. In the grand hallway, the staircase seemed to lead into a void of darkness. The dust-covered steps and dark stains on the banisters were grim reminders of the passage of time and sorrow. The flickering light from the chandelier created long, twisted shadows, their forms merging into grotesque shapes. The oppressive atmosphere was almost suffocating, the air heavy with the scent of decay and despair. The library's empty shelves and broken desk were a testament to the profound neglect that had taken hold. The cold, empty fireplace and the eerie shadows that danced along the walls created a sense of profound discomfort. The oppressive atmosphere of the library was a constant reminder of the house's transformation into a realm of darkness and decay. The bedrooms, with their sagging beds and scattered furniture, were eerie reminders of the house's former comfort. The peeling wallpaper and dark stains on the walls created a sense of profound abandonment. The oppressive atmosphere in each room was a constant reminder of the malevolent force that had claimed the house. The nursery, once a space of innocence and joy, had become a chamber of sorrow. The empty crib, peeling wallpaper, and scattered toys were a grim reminder of what had been lost. The rocking chair's dust-covered surface and the eerie silence of the room created an unsettling atmosphere, the sense of abandonment almost unbearable. In the kitchen, the broken dishes, rotting food, and greasy stove were grim reminders of neglect. The refrigerator's spoiled contents and the oppressive shadows created an atmosphere of profound discomfort. The air was thick with the unpleasant odor of decay, a constant reminder of the house's transformation. The basement and hidden chamber were realms of malevolence and dark energy. The creeping black mold, deep gouges, and dark stains on the walls created a sense of profound dread. The large, heavy door and the cold, oppressive air added to the sense of foreboding. The symbols and dark altar in the hidden chamber were grim reminders of the ancient evil that had taken hold. The attic, cluttered with old relics and covered in dust and grime, was a space of abandonment. The darkened wooden beams and the eerie shadows created an unsettling atmosphere. The large, old trunk, partially open and filled with forgotten belongings, was a grim reminder of the passage of time. As night fell, the house seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the events that were about to unfold. The darkness outside merged with the deep shadows within, creating an ever more oppressive atmosphere. The unseen terrors that lurked in every corner were a reflection of the malevolent force that had consumed the once familiar spaces. The house had become a labyrinth of darkness and dread, each room and corridor a testament to the evil that had taken hold. The echoes of despair and abandonment filled every corner, creating a haunting symphony of sorrow and terror. The malevolent presence seemed to grow stronger, its influence reaching into every shadow and crevice, as the house descended further into a realm of darkness and despair. Chapter 22. The Awakening Shadows. The house lay shrouded in an impenetrable darkness, its once grand halls now a maze of shadow and decay. As twilight descended, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive, the oppressive weight of the malevolent force that had claimed the house becoming more palpable with each passing moment. In the grand hallway, the shadows seemed to deepen, their forms merging into an unsettling, amorphous mass. The staircase, once a symbol of elegance, had become a path into the unknown. The dust-covered steps and dark, tarnished banisters stood as grim reminders of the passage of time. The chandelier overhead flickered erratically, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse with a life of their own. The library, now a chamber of profound despair, was cloaked in a somber gloom. The empty shelves stood as silent witnesses to the house's transformation, their surfaces covered in layers of dust and grime. The large desk in the center of the room, once a place of scholarly pursuits, was now a cluttered mess of broken ink bottles and yellowed papers. The cold, empty fireplace was filled with dark, sooty ashes, the shadows around it casting eerie, shifting shapes. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, the atmosphere laden with the weight of abandonment. Upstairs, the bedrooms had become ghostly realms of decay. The beds, draped in moth-eaten linens, sagged under the weight of years of neglect. The furniture, once meticulously arranged, was now scattered and broken. The once neat spaces now a chaotic mess of debris and decay. The walls, covered in peeling wallpaper and dark stains, seemed to close in, the air heavy with the musty scent of mildew. Each room felt like a haunting reminder of what had been lost, the oppressive atmosphere almost unbearable. In the nursery, the once vibrant colors had faded to a dull, lifeless hue. The crib, empty and forlorn, stood as a stark reminder of the innocence that had once filled the room. The pastel wallpaper was peeling away, revealing dark stains beneath. The toys, scattered and broken, were muted by years of neglect. The rocking chair in the corner, covered in dust and grime, creaked softly with every gust of wind. The sense of abandonment was profound, the air thick with sorrow. The kitchen, now a place of grim neglect, was cluttered with broken dishes, rotting food, and thick layers of grime. The old stove, cold and silent, was covered in grease and dust. The refrigerator door hung ajar, its contents long since spoiled and decomposed. The shadows in the kitchen seemed to move with a life of their own, the darkness creeping into every corner. The air was heavy with the unpleasant odor of rot and mildew, the oppressive atmosphere creating a sense of unease. In the basement, the sense of malevolence was almost tangible. The walls were covered in creeping black mold, their surfaces marred by deep gouges and stains. The temperature was cold and oppressive, the air thick with the scent of decay. The shadows seemed to pulse with a dark energy, their forms merging and twisting into grotesque shapes. The large, heavy door leading to the basement creaked softly, its presence a grim reminder of the darkness below. The hidden chamber beneath the basement was a realm of ancient evil. The walls were covered in faded symbols and dark, twisted drawings, their meanings obscured by time. The large, dark altar in the center of the chamber was covered in dark stains and cobwebs, its presence a dark reminder of the past. The circle of twisted, dark symbols etched into the floor seemed to writhe and shift, creating an unsettling mosaic. The air around the altar was cold and oppressive, the sense of malevolence almost overwhelming. In the attic, the space was cluttered with forgotten belongings and covered in a thick layer of dust. The wooden beams that supported the ceiling were darkened with moisture and decay, covered in creeping black mold. The shadows cast by the dim light of a single bulb seemed to crawl along the walls, creating an eerie play of light and darkness. The large, old trunk in the attic was partially open, its contents a jumble of old clothing, yellowed documents, and broken trinkets. The atmosphere in the attic was one of profound abandonment. As night fell, the house seemed to grow even darker and more oppressive. The shadows in the grand hallway deepened, their forms merging into a dense, swirling mass. The flickering light from the chandelier cast eerie, shifting patterns on the walls, creating an unsettling play of light and darkness. The once familiar space was now a realm of dread, the oppressive atmosphere almost suffocating. In the library, the empty shelves and broken desk were shrouded in a somber gloom. The cold, empty fireplace and the eerie shadows that danced along the walls created a sense of profound unease. The oppressive atmosphere was a constant reminder of the house's transformation into a realm of darkness and despair. The bedrooms, with their sagging beds and scattered furniture, were eerie reminders of the house's former comfort. The peeling wallpaper and dark stains on the walls created a sense of profound abandonment. The oppressive atmosphere in each room was a grim reminder of the malevolent force that had claimed the house. The nursery, once a space of innocence and joy, had become a chamber of sorrow. The empty crib, peeling wallpaper, and scattered toys were grim reminders of what had been lost. The rocking chair's dust-covered surface and the eerie silence of the room created an unsettling atmosphere, the sense of abandonment almost unbearable. In the kitchen, the broken dishes, rotting food, and greasy stove were grim reminders of neglect. The refrigerator's spoiled contents and the oppressive shadows created an atmosphere of profound discomfort. The air was thick with the unpleasant odor of decay, a constant reminder of the house's transformation. The basement and hidden chamber were realms of malevolence and dark energy. The creeping black mold, deep gouges, and dark stains on the walls created a sense of profound dread. The large, heavy door and the cold, oppressive air added to the sense of foreboding. The symbols and dark altar in the hidden chamber were grim reminders of the ancient evil that had taken hold. The attic, cluttered with old relics and covered in dust and grime, was a space of profound abandonment. The darkened wooden beams and the eerie shadows created an unsettling atmosphere. The large, old trunk, partially open and filled with forgotten belongings, was a grim reminder of the passage of time. As the night deepened, the house seemed to come alive with an eerie, malevolent energy. The shadows in every room and corridor seemed to shift and pulse with a dark intent. The oppressive silence was occasionally broken by the distant creaks and groans of the old structure, each noise echoing like a whisper of some unseen terror. The darkness seemed to press in on every side, the oppressive atmosphere a constant reminder of the evil that had claimed the house. The house had become a labyrinth of darkness and despair, each room and corridor a testament to the malevolent force that had taken hold. The echoes of abandonment and sorrow filled every corner, creating a haunting symphony of dread. The malevolent presence seemed to grow stronger, its influence reaching into every shadow and crevice. The once familiar spaces had been twisted into realms of darkness, each room a reflection of the evil that lurked within. Chapter 23: The Convergence. The house, enveloped in darkness, seemed to pulse with an almost palpable sense of foreboding. As night deepened, the oppressive atmosphere grew thicker, the air heavy with the weight of the malevolent force that had taken hold. The once grand halls, now mere corridors of shadow, seemed to breathe with an unnatural rhythm, each creak and groan a whisper of the house's dark transformation. In the grand hallway, the flickering light of the tarnished chandelier cast long, erratic shadows that danced along the walls. The staircase, once a symbol of elegance and stability, now seemed to descend into an abyss of darkness. The dust-covered steps and dark, tarnished banisters stood as grim reminders of neglect. The shadows that played across the walls seemed to writhe and pulse with an unsettling energy, their forms shifting into grotesque shapes. The library, a chamber of profound despair, was suffused with a cold, oppressive silence. The empty shelves, now covered in thick layers of dust, stood as silent sentinels of the house's decay. The large desk, once a place of scholarly pursuits, was now a cluttered mess of broken ink bottles and yellowed papers. The cold, empty fireplace, filled with dark, sooty ashes, seemed to hold an ancient malevolence. The shadows in the library moved with an unnatural fluidity, their forms merging into an eerie, ever-shifting darkness. The air was heavy with the weight of abandonment, the oppressive atmosphere almost suffocating. Upstairs, the bedrooms had become ghostly realms of decay. The beds, draped in moth-eaten linens, sagged under the weight of years of neglect. The furniture, once meticulously arranged, was now scattered and broken. The once neat spaces now a chaotic mess of debris and decay. The walls, covered in peeling wallpaper and dark stains, seemed to close in, the air thick with the musty scent of mildew. Each room felt like a haunting reminder of what had been lost, the oppressive atmosphere almost unbearable. The nursery, a space of faded innocence, had become a chamber of profound sorrow. The crib, empty and forlorn, stood as a stark reminder of the joy that had once filled the room. The pastel wallpaper was peeling away, revealing dark stains beneath. The toys, scattered and broken, were muted by years of neglect. The rocking chair in the corner, covered in dust and grime, creaked softly with every gust of wind. The air in the nursery was thick with a sense of abandonment, the oppressive atmosphere creating a profound sense of dread. In the kitchen, the signs of neglect were evident in every corner. The countertops, cluttered with broken dishes and rotting food, were coated in thick layers of grime. The old stove, cold and silent, was covered in grease and dust. The refrigerator door hung ajar, its contents long spoiled and decomposed. The shadows in the kitchen seemed to move with a life of their own, the darkness creeping into every corner. The air was heavy with the unpleasant odor of rot and mildew, the oppressive atmosphere creating a sense of unease. The basement, a realm of dark energy and malevolence, seemed to exude an almost tangible sense of dread. The walls were covered in creeping black mold, their surfaces marred by deep gouges and stains. The temperature was cold and oppressive, the air thick with the scent of decay. The shadows seemed to pulse with a dark energy, their forms merging and twisting into grotesque shapes. The large, heavy door leading to the basement creaked softly, its presence a grim reminder of the darkness below. The hidden chamber beneath the basement was a place of ancient malevolence. The walls were covered in faded symbols and dark, twisted drawings, their meanings obscured by time. The large, dark altar in the center of the chamber was covered in dark stains and cobwebs, its presence a grim reminder of the past. The circle of twisted, dark symbols etched into the floor seemed to writhe and shift, creating an unsettling mosaic. The air around the altar was cold and oppressive, the sense of malevolence almost overwhelming. In the attic, the space was cluttered with forgotten belongings and covered in a thick layer of dust. The wooden beams that supported the ceiling were darkened with moisture and decay, covered in creeping black mold. The shadows cast by the dim light of a single bulb seemed to crawl along the walls, creating an eerie play of light and darkness. The large, old trunk in the attic was partially open, its contents a jumble of old clothing, yellowed documents, and broken trinkets. The atmosphere in the attic was one of profound abandonment. As the night wore on, the house seemed to come alive with an eerie, malevolent energy. The shadows in every room and corridor seemed to grow darker and more intense. The oppressive silence was occasionally broken by the distant creaks and groans of the old structure, each noise echoing like a whisper of some unseen terror. The darkness seemed to press in on every side, the oppressive atmosphere a constant reminder of the evil that had claimed the house. In the grand hallway, the shadows grew deeper, their forms merging into an unsettling, swirling mass. The flickering light from the chandelier created long, twisted patterns on the walls, adding to the sense of dread. The once familiar space had become a realm of darkness, the oppressive atmosphere almost suffocating. The library's empty shelves and broken desk were shrouded in a somber gloom. The cold, empty fireplace and the eerie shadows that danced along the walls created a sense of profound unease. The oppressive atmosphere of the library was a constant reminder of the house's transformation into a realm of darkness and despair. The bedrooms, with their sagging beds and scattered furniture, were ghostly reminders of the house's former comfort. The peeling wallpaper and dark stains on the walls created a sense of abandonment and sorrow. The oppressive atmosphere in each room was a grim reminder of the malevolent force that had claimed the house. In the nursery, the empty crib, peeling wallpaper, and scattered toys were grim reminders of what had been lost. The rocking chair's dust-covered surface and the eerie silence of the room created an unsettling atmosphere, the sense of abandonment almost unbearable. The kitchen, with its broken dishes, rotting food, and greasy stove, was a grim repository of neglect. The refrigerator's spoiled contents and the oppressive shadows created an atmosphere of profound discomfort. The air was thick with the unpleasant odor of decay, a constant reminder of the house's transformation. The basement and hidden chamber were realms of dark energy and malevolence. The creeping black mold, deep gouges, and dark stains on the walls created a sense of profound dread. The large, heavy door and the cold, oppressive air added to the sense of foreboding. The symbols and dark altar in the hidden chamber were grim reminders of the ancient evil that had taken hold. In the attic, the cluttered space and covered belongings were a testament to the house's abandonment. The darkened wooden beams and eerie shadows created an unsettling atmosphere. The large, old trunk, partially open and filled with forgotten relics, was a grim reminder of the passage of time. As midnight approached, a sense of convergence began to permeate the house. The shadows in every room seemed to grow more intense, their forms merging into a dense, swirling mass. The oppressive atmosphere became almost unbearable, the darkness pressing in on every side. The house seemed to hold its breath, the anticipation of the impending events palpable. The dark energy within the house seemed to reach a crescendo, its influence seeping into every corner. The once familiar spaces had been transformed into realms of darkness and despair, each room a reflection of the malevolent force that had claimed the house. The shadows that danced along the walls seemed to pulse with an unsettling rhythm, their forms shifting and merging into grotesque shapes. In the grand hallway, the shadows seemed to coalesce into a dense, swirling mass. The flickering light from the chandelier cast long, twisted patterns on the walls, creating an eerie play of light and darkness. The staircase, now a path into the unknown, seemed to descend into an abyss of darkness. The dust-covered steps and dark, tarnished banisters stood as grim reminders of the passage of time and neglect. The library, with its empty shelves and broken desk, was shrouded in a profound gloom. The cold, empty fireplace and the eerie shadows that danced along the walls created a sense of deep unease. The oppressive atmosphere was a constant reminder of the house's transformation into a realm of darkness and despair. The bedrooms, with their sagging beds and scattered furniture, were eerie reminders of the house's former comfort. The peeling wallpaper and dark stains on the walls created a sense of profound abandonment. The oppressive atmosphere in each room was a grim reminder of the malevolent force that had claimed the house. The nursery, once a space of innocence, had become a chamber of sorrow. The empty crib, peeling wallpaper, and scattered toys were grim reminders of what had been lost. The rocking chair's dust-covered surface and the eerie silence of the room created an unsettling atmosphere, the sense of abandonment almost unbearable. In the kitchen, the broken dishes, rotting food, and greasy stove were grim reminders of neglect. The refrigerator's spoiled contents and the oppressive shadows created an atmosphere of profound discomfort. The air was thick with the unpleasant odor of decay, a constant reminder of the house's transformation. The basement and hidden chamber were realms of dark energy and malevolence. The creeping black mold, deep gouges, and dark stains on the walls created a sense of profound dread. The large, heavy door and the cold, oppressive air added to the sense of foreboding. The symbols and dark altar in the hidden chamber were grim reminders of the ancient evil that had taken hold. In the attic, the cluttered space and covered belongings were a testament to the house's abandonment. The darkened wooden beams and eerie shadows created an unsettling atmosphere. The large, old trunk, partially open and filled with forgotten relics, was a grim reminder of the passage of time. As the night drew to a close, the house seemed to hold its breath, the sense of convergence reaching its zenith. The shadows, the oppressive silence, and the malevolent energy had coalesced into a singular, overwhelming force. The house, now a vessel of pure darkness, seemed to writhe and pulse with an eerie, almost sentient energy. The oppressive atmosphere was a constant reminder of the evil that had claimed the house, each corner a reflection of the malevolent presence that pervaded every inch of the structure. Chapter 24. The Unraveling. The house, now steeped in an almost tangible malevolence, seemed to exhale its darkest secrets as the night wore on. The oppressive silence that enveloped the grand hallway was intermittently pierced by the distant creaks and groans of the old structure, each sound echoing like a whisper of the house's deep-seated torment. The once gleaming chandelier, now a twisted relic of its former glory, cast erratic, flickering light that played across the walls, creating an ever-shifting tapestry of shadows. The grand staircase, coated in a thick layer of dust, appeared to descend into a void of darkness. The handrails, dark and tarnished, were marred by the passage of time, and the shadows that wove their way up and down the steps seemed to pulsate with a sinister energy. The air around the staircase grew colder with each passing minute, the oppressive atmosphere almost suffocating. The library, now a chamber of profound despair, was engulfed in a dense gloom. The empty shelves, cloaked in dust and neglect, stood as silent witnesses to the house's decay. The large desk in the center of the room, once a symbol of intellectual pursuit, was now a chaotic tangle of broken ink bottles and yellowed papers. The cold, empty fireplace, with its dark, sooty ashes, seemed to absorb the flickering light from a single, dim lamp. The shadows in the library writhed and twisted, their movements unnatural and disquieting. The oppressive silence was a constant reminder of the malevolent presence that pervaded the space. The bedrooms upstairs had transformed into eerie realms of decay. The sagging beds, covered in moth-eaten linens, seemed to sag under the weight of years of neglect. The furniture, once carefully arranged, was now scattered and broken. The once pristine spaces now chaotic and forlorn. The walls, draped in peeling wallpaper and dark stains, seemed to close in, the air thick with the musty scent of mildew. Each room, with its oppressive atmosphere, felt like a haunting echo of what had once been. The nursery, once a haven of innocence, had become a chamber of sorrow. The empty crib, forlorn and desolate, stood as a stark reminder of the joy that had once filled the room. The pastel wallpaper, peeling away to reveal dark stains, created a sense of profound melancholy. The scattered toys, now broken and mute, were overshadowed by years of neglect. The rocking chair in the corner, draped in dust and grime, creaked softly with every gust of wind. The air in the nursery was thick with the weight of abandonment, the oppressive atmosphere creating an almost unbearable sense of loss. In the kitchen, the neglect was evident in every corner. The counters, cluttered with broken dishes and rotting food, were encrusted with thick layers of grime. The old stove, cold and silent, was covered in grease and dust. The refrigerator door hung ajar, its contents long spoiled and decomposed. The shadows in the kitchen seemed to move with a life of their own, the darkness creeping into every nook and cranny. The air was laden with the unpleasant odor of decay, the oppressive atmosphere a grim reminder of the house's transformation. The basement, now a realm of dark energy and foreboding, seemed to exude an almost palpable sense of dread. The walls, coated in creeping black mold and marred by deep gouges and stains, created a chilling atmosphere. The temperature was uncomfortably cold, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The shadows in the basement seemed to pulse with a dark, almost sentient energy, their forms merging and twisting into grotesque shapes. The large, heavy door leading to the basement creaked ominously, its presence a grim reminder of the darkness below. The hidden chamber beneath the basement was a place of ancient and profound evil. The walls were covered in faded, sinister symbols and dark, twisted drawings, their meanings obscured by time. The large, dark altar in the center of the chamber was coated in dark stains and cobwebs, its presence a grim testament to the malevolence that had once been worshipped here. The circle of twisted, dark symbols etched into the floor seemed to writhe and shift, creating an unsettling, almost hypnotic mosaic. The air around the altar was cold and oppressive, the sense of malevolence almost overwhelming. In the attic, the space was cluttered with forgotten belongings and covered in a thick layer of dust. The wooden beams that supported the ceiling were darkened with moisture and decay, covered in creeping black mold. The shadows cast by the dim light of a single bulb seemed to crawl along the walls, creating an eerie and unsettling play of light and darkness. The large, old trunk in the attic was partially open, its contents a jumble of old clothing, yellowed documents, and broken trinkets. The atmosphere in the attic was one of profound abandonment, each item a relic of a past now lost. As the night deepened, the sense of convergence within the house became almost palpable. The shadows in every room seemed to merge and grow more intense, their forms twisting and pulsating with an unsettling rhythm. The oppressive silence was occasionally broken by the distant creaks and groans of the old structure, each noise a haunting echo of some unseen terror. The darkness seemed to press in on every side, the oppressive atmosphere a constant reminder of the evil that had claimed the house. In the grand hallway, the shadows seemed to coalesce into a dense, swirling mass. The flickering light from the chandelier cast long, twisted patterns on the walls, creating an eerie play of light and darkness. The staircase, now a path into the unknown, seemed to descend into an abyss of darkness. The dust-covered steps and dark, tarnished banisters stood as grim reminders of the passage of time and neglect. The library, with its empty shelves and broken desk, was shrouded in a profound gloom. The cold, empty fireplace and the eerie shadows that danced along the walls created a sense of deep unease. The oppressive atmosphere was a constant reminder of the house's transformation into a realm of darkness and despair. The bedrooms, with their sagging beds and scattered furniture, were eerie reminders of the house's former comfort. The peeling wallpaper and dark stains on the walls created a sense of abandonment and sorrow. The oppressive atmosphere in each room was a grim reminder of the malevolent force that had claimed the house. The nursery, once a space of innocence, had become a chamber of profound sorrow. The empty crib, peeling wallpaper, and scattered toys were grim reminders of what had been lost. The rocking chair's dust-covered surface and the eerie silence of the room created an unsettling atmosphere, the sense of abandonment almost unbearable. In the kitchen, the broken dishes, rotting food, and greasy stove were grim reminders of neglect. The refrigerator's spoiled contents and the oppressive shadows created an atmosphere of profound discomfort. The air was thick with the unpleasant odor of decay, a constant reminder of the house's transformation. The basement and hidden chamber were realms of dark energy and malevolence. The creeping black mold, deep gouges, and dark stains on the walls created a sense of profound dread. The large, heavy door and the cold, oppressive air added to the sense of foreboding. The symbols and dark altar in the hidden chamber were grim reminders of the ancient evil that had taken hold. In the attic, the cluttered space and covered belongings were a testament to the house's abandonment. The darkened wooden beams and eerie shadows created an unsettling atmosphere. The large, old trunk, partially open and filled with forgotten relics, was a grim reminder of the passage of time. As the night continued its inexorable march, the house seemed to reach a critical juncture. The shadows, once mere aberrations of light, now seemed to have a life of their own, converging and intertwining in a dark dance. The oppressive silence of the house grew heavier, almost as if it were holding its breath in anticipation of something profound and terrible. Each room, each corridor, seemed to become a part of a greater whole, their darkness merging into an all-encompassing void. The oppressive atmosphere, the relentless shadows, and the chilling silence created an atmosphere of impending dread. The house, once a grand and vibrant home, had become a labyrinth of darkness, each shadow and creak a reminder of the malevolent force that had claimed it. In the heart of this darkness, the convergence reached its peak. The shadows, the oppressive silence, and the malevolent energy seemed to coalesce into a singular, overwhelming force. The house, now a vessel of pure darkness, seemed to writhe and pulse with an eerie, almost sentient energy. The oppressive atmosphere was a constant reminder of the evil that had taken hold, each corner of the house a reflection of the malevolent presence that had claimed it. The night was far from over, and the house's transformation into a realm of darkness and despair was far from complete. Chapter 25. The Final Confrontation. The night deepened into an abyssal silence, the house shrouded in an almost suffocating darkness. The oppressive atmosphere was now palpable, each shadow and creak of the old structure amplifying the sense of imminent dread. The house seemed to pulse with a malignant energy, the air thick with an unnatural chill. The grand hallway, the heart of the house, had become a scene of grotesque transformation. The shadows, which had once merely flickered and danced, now coalesced into a dark, swirling mass. The flickering light from the tarnished chandelier struggled to pierce through the enveloping darkness, casting long, distorted shapes on the walls. The staircase, dust-covered and sagging, seemed to lead into an infinite void. The oppressive silence was punctuated only by the occasional, eerie creak of the old wooden steps. The library, once a place of knowledge and contemplation, had become a chamber of intense foreboding. The empty shelves and broken desk were now bathed in a cold, ghostly light that seemed to emanate from the shadows themselves. The walls, adorned with dark stains and peeling wallpaper, seemed to absorb the light, deepening the sense of despair. The shadows in the library twisted and writhed, their movements almost hypnotic in their malevolence. Upstairs, the bedrooms were eerily silent. The sagging beds and scattered, broken furniture were enveloped in darkness, the oppressive atmosphere creating an almost tangible sense of abandonment. The peeling wallpaper and dark stains on the walls seemed to close in, the very air growing heavier with each passing moment. Each room, once filled with life, now felt like a mausoleum, holding the remnants of a past now lost. The nursery, with its empty crib and faded pastel wallpaper, had become a symbol of profound sorrow. The scattered, broken toys lay in a silent, desolate heap, their presence a stark reminder of the joy that had once filled the room. The rocking chair, draped in dust and grime, creaked softly with the movement of the air, its sound eerily unsettling in the otherwise oppressive silence. In the kitchen, The signs of neglect were starkly evident. The counters, cluttered with broken dishes and rotting food, were coated in thick layers of grime. The old stove, cold and silent, was covered in grease and dust, its once functional surface now a grim testament to decay. The refrigerator door hung ajar, revealing the grotesque sight of spoiled and decomposed contents. The oppressive shadows seemed to seep into every corner, creating an atmosphere of profound discomfort. The basement, now a realm of darkness and malevolence, exuded a palpable sense of dread. The walls, covered in creeping black mold and deep gouges, seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The temperature was frigid, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The shadows in the basement moved with an almost sentient malice, their forms twisting and merging into grotesque shapes. The heavy, creaking door leading to the basement stood as a grim barrier between the known and the unknown. The hidden chamber beneath the basement was a place of ancient evil. The walls, covered in faded and sinister symbols, seemed to exude a malevolent energy. The large, dark altar in the center of the chamber was coated in dark stains and cobwebs, its presence a grim reminder of the malevolence once worshipped here. The circle of twisted symbols etched into the floor seemed to writhe and shift, creating a haunting, almost hypnotic pattern. The air around the altar was cold and oppressive, the sense of evil almost overwhelming. In the attic, the cluttered space was covered in a thick layer of dust. The wooden beams that supported the ceiling were darkened with moisture and decay, their presence adding to the eerie atmosphere. The large, old trunk in the attic, partially open, revealed a jumble of old clothing, yellowed documents, and broken trinkets. The dim light from a single bulb cast long, eerie shadows, creating an unsettling play of light and darkness. As the night wore on, the house seemed to reach a critical juncture. The oppressive silence was occasionally broken by distant creaks and groans, each noise amplifying the sense of impending dread. The shadows in every room seemed to merge into a dark, swirling mass, the oppressive atmosphere becoming almost unbearable. The grand hallway, now a realm of darkness, was the focal point of the house's malevolence. The swirling shadows and distorted shapes on the walls seemed to close in, creating a sense of impending doom. The staircase, leading into an infinite void, seemed to beckon with an eerie, almost sentient force. The oppressive silence was a constant reminder of the malevolent presence that pervaded the house. In the library, the darkness had reached its zenith. The cold, ghostly light from the shadows cast eerie patterns on the walls, deepening the sense of despair. The empty shelves and broken desk were now bathed in a grim, oppressive gloom, the very air in the room heavy with malevolent energy. The bedrooms, once havens of comfort, had become ghostly realms of decay. The sagging beds, scattered furniture, and peeling wallpaper created an atmosphere of profound abandonment. Each room felt like a mausoleum, holding the remnants of a past now lost. The nursery, with its empty crib and scattered toys, was a chamber of deep sorrow. The rocking chairs creaking and the oppressive silence of the room added to the sense of profound loss and abandonment. In the kitchen, the broken dishes, rotting food, and greasy stove were grim reminders of neglect. The oppressive shadows and unpleasant odor of decay created an atmosphere of profound discomfort. The basement and hidden chamber, with their dark energy and malevolence, were realms of profound dread. The creeping black mold, deep gouges, and dark stains on the walls created a sense of unease. The symbols and dark altar in the hidden chamber were grim reminders of the ancient evil that had taken hold. In the attic, the cluttered space and covered belongings were a testament to the house's abandonment. The darkened wooden beams and eerie shadows created an unsettling atmosphere. The large, old trunk, filled with forgotten relics, was a grim reminder of the passage of time. As the night drew to a close, the sense of convergence reached its peak. The shadows, the oppressive silence, and the malevolent energy had coalesced into a singular, overwhelming force. The house, now a vessel of pure darkness, seemed to writhe and pulse with an almost sentient energy. The oppressive atmosphere was a constant reminder of the evil that had claimed the house, each corner a reflection of the malevolent presence that pervaded every inch of the structure. In the final moments of the night, the house seemed to hold its breath. The shadows converged into a dark, swirling vortex in the grand hallway, their movements creating an almost hypnotic pattern. The flickering light from the chandelier struggled to pierce through the enveloping darkness, casting long, distorted shapes that added to the eerie atmosphere. The air was thick with a sense of impending dread, the oppressive silence almost deafening. As the first light of dawn began to break through the darkness, the house seemed to exhale a sigh of release. The oppressive energy that had pervaded every room began to dissipate, the shadows slowly retreating. The grand hallway, once a realm of darkness, began to regain a semblance of its former self. The flickering light from the chandelier grew steadier, casting a more natural illumination on the walls. The dust-covered floors and tarnished banisters seemed to absorb the light, the sense of malevolence gradually fading. The library, once a chamber of profound gloom, began to reclaim a sense of normalcy. The empty shelves and broken desk were still marked by neglect, but the cold, ghostly light that had bathed the room was replaced by a more natural illumination. The oppressive atmosphere began to lift, the shadows retreating into the corners. Upstairs, the bedrooms began to regain a semblance of their former comfort. The sagging beds and scattered furniture were still reminders of the house's decline, but the oppressive atmosphere that had once pervaded each room was dissipating. The peeling wallpaper and dark stains on the walls remained, but the sense of abandonment was less pronounced. The nursery, with its empty crib and scattered toys, began to feel less sorrowful. The rocking chair's creaking was now just a distant echo, the oppressive silence giving way to a more tranquil atmosphere. The sense of profound loss and abandonment was slowly lifting. In the kitchen, the signs of neglect were still evident, but the oppressive shadows and unpleasant odor of decay were gradually fading. The broken dishes and rotting food remained, but the atmosphere was less discomforting. The basement and hidden chamber, once realms of dark energy, began to reclaim a sense of normalcy. The creeping black mold and deep gouges on the walls were still present, but the malevolent energy had dissipated. The dark symbols and altar in the hidden chamber remained, but their presence was less foreboding. In the attic, the cluttered space and covered belongings still testified to the house's abandonment. The darkened wooden beams and eerie shadows remained, but the unsettling atmosphere had lifted. The large, old trunk, filled with forgotten relics, was now a silent reminder of the past. As dawn fully broke, the house began to return to a state of relative normalcy. The oppressive darkness and malevolent energy that had pervaded every room had dissipated, leaving behind a somber, but less foreboding, structure. The grand hallway, the library, the bedrooms, the nursery, the kitchen, the basement, the hidden chamber, and the attic all remained as relics of the house's dark past, but the sense of impending doom had faded. The house, now bathed in the soft light of morning, stood as a testament to the night's horrors, a grim reminder of the evil that had once claimed it. The final remnants of the dark energy seemed to retreat into the deepest recesses of the house, leaving behind a somber silence. The house, now a shadow of its former self, stood as a chilling reminder of the night's events. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, but the scars of the house's dark past remained. The house had survived the final confrontation, but its lingering presence was a testament to the malevolent forces that had once dwelled within its walls. The dawn brought with it a new beginning, but the house would forever bear the mark of the darkness that had once consumed it.